struggling to separate themselves, much like the residents of Jubilation. Looking up, I witness hundreds of hands gripping the shattered window frames, unable to turn myself away as thousands of polished black shoes step over the threshold. The figures stream out from every floor, forming an incomprehensible deluge of humanity. The first wave strikes the ground, and with more and more landing against them, a heap of tangled figures struggling to separate themselves, much like the residents of Jubilation, and everyone else we've encountered on the road. They appear impervious to the fatal harm such an act should impart. Those who landed on their feet hardly even stop, turning toward us and sprinting after the Wrangler. It doesn't take long for the rest of the writhing mass to resolve itself, its constituent individuals joining the frantic stampede, their chaotic charge and desperate screams bereft of any perceivable sound, even in the midst of the frenzied pursuit. As a foreboding shower of glass falls from every building we pass, the world outside remains silent, the chaos made even more incomprehensible, framed against the ungodly stillness in which it takes place. Rob screeches around the corner, drifting onto the long and open street. The roadway ahead is flanked by skyscrapers, disappearing to a narrow vanishing point. As we race down this next stretch of road towards a large intersection, the ever-growing mob bursts onto the street behind us, taking the corner with supreme coordination and continuing tirelessly in our direction. A split second later, I'm struck with an abrupt and pervasive idea. It feels unlike any thought I've ever had before, like less of a notion and more of a prescient hybrid of intuition and deja vu, as if the course of action that we must take is obvious to me despite me knowing why. I force my voice above a grating whisper. Rob, we need to drop something behind us. We need to drop something behind us. Something loud. What are you thinking? You just have to trust me, okay? We still have most of the plastic explosive. Could you... Nah. If you took out the blasting cap, I ain't got time to make a new one. Rob glances in the rear view, then back to the road. I can almost hear the gears turning in his head. But that's the only explosive on board. Think you can drive? I guess we can find out. The car thunders across the tarmac as I clumsily grasp the wheel, shifting myself over and working my foot onto the accelerator. Rob lifts himself away and climbs past me into the back of the Wrangler. In my weak state, every shuddering motion makes my bones rattle. With each subsequent gear shift, I'm forced to take my remaining hand off the wheel and reach across to the stick. The effort is precarious and awkward, my aching limbs puppeteered by willpower and adrenaline, every passing second a battle to maintain control. The windows up ahead are starting to fracture, the noise the Wrangler is carrying, and the entire city is starting to preempt our arrival. Behind me, I can hear a ripping of duct tape, the tearing of fabric, and the clattering of falling luggage. I'm not sure what's taking place behind me. I just have to trust that Rob has a plan. I hear the back door swing open just before we reach the intersection. A metallic scraping along the Wrangler's floor, a pained grunt from Rob as he throws something out into the road behind us. Reaching the crossroads, I slide my hand along the wheel and twist it sharply to the right. As the car lurches round and onto the next road, I feel my heart sink dramatically. We've been overtaken. The windows ahead of us are shattered, and the building's desperate inhabitants are rushing towards us, blocking off our only means of escape. I slam my foot onto the brakes, and the Wrangler shudders to a halt, the engine stalling and cutting out. The streets are now spilling over, an overwhelming swarm converging on our position from 4 directions. I look back at Rob, and he meets my gaze, his eyes brimming with a dismayed finality. An explosion shudders through the air behind us. I look out the back window to see a shattered jerry can, one of Rob's now superfluous fuel reserves. Its dark green shell violently compromised, its contents spilled out across the road and cast a light. The echo of the blast and roar of the primal balletic flame fills the afternoon air. The trajectory of the maddened crowd changes instantaneously. The silent Wrangler has fallen from their collective attention. As they refocus onto the smoldering flames, those up ahead continue to rush past, streaming around the Wrangler as they scramble to the spilled pool of gasoline, digging their hands into the blaze, grasping hopelessly at the fire. Delicately, carefully, not to make a single shred of noise, I climb out of the driver's seat, joining Rob in the back of the Wrangler. He addresses me in a confused whisper. Why don't they care about us? What are they doing? It's the sound. They want it for themselves. I don't know how I'm so sure, but I know that it's the case. The jerry can creaks and screams as the city dwellers tear it into smaller and smaller pieces, frantically examining every jagged scrap. With each passing second, as the fire dies down, the crowd grows increasingly distressed, as if a precious commodity is slipping through their fingers. They don't understand it. They'll pull it apart trying to figure it out, and they'll never get any closer. And then it'll be quiet again. Where are you getting this from? I don't know. It's just a feeling. Well, pretty sure they would have pulled us apart too. I'd say we're pretty lucky. Yeah, pretty lucky. As the last of the gasoline is eaten up and the fire dies away, the city dwellers remained in the street, devoid of their momentary sense of purpose, the prize vanishing into the ether. The crowd's desperation fades into a hushed despondency. I watch them as they pass by, countless faces racked with sorrow, their aimless shuffling forming a loathsome sea, a grayscale ocean that spans the desolate city. The Wrangler is now adrift in the center of that ocean. It's clear that any attempt to start the engine would bring the entire city down on us, reigniting their futile hope, causing them to tear through the car and anything inside. For the foreseeable future, we're completely stranded. Hey, don't worry about it, okay? I don't think they're going to leave, Rob. They'll leave. Okay, and what then? They'll still be everywhere. Hey, we're a smart pair. We'll think of something. In the eerie, pervasive calm that surrounds us, I sit myself down next to Rob and lean back against the wall, with nothing else to do but wait for our situation to change. After watching the figures outside for over an hour, the only thing that's different is a strange needling sensation that feels like it's emanating from my now absent forearm. My arm hurts. How is that possible? Don't worry, that's, it's called phantom limb. You got some sensation, right? Like you still got something there. A lot of people get that after amputations. Here, Rob reaches into his medical kit and retracts a blue jar of tablets. Twisting off the cap, he shakes 2 pills free. You're gonna need these for the pain. I stare at the tablets for a moment. Before collecting them from his open palm, he passes me his canteen and I swallow them down in 2 weak gulps. You have a lot of experience with amputation? More than you'd think. My brow furrows, though. I'd meant my remark as a passing jibe. Rob's response rings with a strange sincerity. It takes me a moment to realize why that is. I forgot. You were drafted. You never talked about that. Been thinking a lot about it, though. Bunch of strangers brought together under false pretenses, told that they were serving a grand purpose by some old liar. Guess it's interesting how time repeats itself, now that I think about it. He drove a Jeep too. Rob, I told you, you didn't bring us here. That don't change nothing. Don't change what I did. To you, to Bobby, to any of them. Maybe you were there in the forest, but I was the one who started this. The one who kept asking what was at the end of the road. What do you think is at the end of the road, Rob? I'm starting to think that ain't for me to know. I've been moving from place to place so long, seeing everyone else settle down. As far as I can see, the end of the road is just wherever you decide to stop. I rest my head on Rob's shoulder. He gently places his arm around me. It isn't long before the medication starts to take effect, quietly overtaking my already weakened constitution. The pain subsides, dulled along with the rest of my senses. The sun is still streaming through the window as my eyes begin to drift shut. I watch as the figures pass the window, my eyelids getting weaker. I don't want this to end, Rob. I know, Miss Sharma. I know. The last thing I see before I fall into a dreamless, artificial sleep is Rob Guthard's hand reaching for the rifle. When my eyes work themselves open, the sun is beginning to set. I've been moved. As my vision adjusts, it becomes clear that I'm still in the Wrangler, my head resting against a pile of fresh clothes. A soft travel blanket laid across me. I glance around to find Rob's nowhere to be seen. Momentarily forgetting the situation outside the car, I attempt to call out for him. The syllable catches in my throat as a shambling figure passes my window, wringing its hand in despair and casting a long shadow through the car. With a renewed sense of caution, I slide the blanket to one side and slowly make my way up front. The cabin is similarly empty, except for a single scrap of paper torn from my notebook. It lies in the driver's seat, a small object hidden within the fold. When I open it, I find my headphones and 5 neatly written words. Channel 1 to all cars. My hand starts to shake as I rest the note on the dashboard, slowly climbing through and placing myself gently in the driver's seat. My heart in my throat, I insert the headphones into the jack of the CB radio. I take a single, quivering breath in and press the first button. Rob? I'm sorry, Miss Sharma. Rob, where are you? Got myself to one of the rooftops. I know I always hated cities, but once you're above it, the view's really something. Rob? Come back, Rob. Come back, please. I wish I could. I do. But we both know those things ain't leaving. You need the car to get wherever you gotta go, so best I can do is make some ruckus, draw him out of your way. I rest my head against the steering wheel, bracing myself against the weight of his words. I can't do this without you. I don't think that's true, Miss Sharma. I think whatever's on this road, it wants you to make it all the way. All I was meant to do was bring you this far. Now you don't have to listen to it. You can turn around and head home, but either way, only one of us is driving out of here. So I guess the only question left is, which way are you gonna go? Well, are you ahead of me or behind me? I can be anywhere. It's your choice, Miss Sharma. In the wake of Rob's words, in the shadow of the decision, I'm cast into silence. Not because the choice is hard, but because I'm ashamed it's so easy. It was made the moment I first stepped into the Wrangler, and renewed in every perplexing moment since. The need to know, to comprehend, to uncover the truth has been with me my entire life, but I never knew its roots ran so deep that it would endure so ardently when everything else, everyone else, had been stripped away. I stare into the rearview mirror, seeing myself for the very first time. I have to admit, I'm scared. Stay where you are, Rob. Okay, Miss Sharma. You ready? Yeah, I'm ready. Alright then. Suppose it's about time this thing did some good. The shot explodes through the radio before a faint booming echo reaches me on the quiet city air. Its effect on the city dwellers is immediate. Their collective melancholy shatters in an instant, replaced by a renewed fixation. Before I know it, the desperate crowd unites once more into a stampeding horde, rushing past the windows of the Wrangler and back down the road towards the source of the sound. They on their way? As the last of the city dwellers disappear behind me, I run my hand across the steering wheel and down the ignition. Yeah, they're on their way. Okay then. What are you waiting for? With a fateful twist of the key, the Wrangler roars back to life. The wheels kick against the asphalt, transporting me through the streets of the city as I barrel away from the intersection, losing ground against the Wrangler. I take the first left, then the next possible right, then another left. A few minutes later, I eventually find myself on the last stretch of road, leading back to the vast and empty desert. So, you gonna make it? Yeah. I'm gonna make it. That's good. That's good. Miss Sharma, if you find Marjorie, if you get a chance to let me know, well, it's more than I deserve, but of course I will. I appreciate that. Okay, they're gonna be here soon, so I'm gonna go radio silent for a while. If I call, you'll know I made it out. If I don't, you just assume I made it out, okay? Please tell me you're going to be alright, Rob. It's been a real honor driving with you, Miss Sharma. The sound of the final shots reverberate throughout the radio, its echo drowned out by the roaring engine of the Wrangler. The world shifts around me as I burst out of the city and back onto the desert road. The way ahead is laden with immense possibility, yet as I disappear into the vastness of the desert, I can only think of what I've left behind. Rob J. Guthard had his flaws, marked by loss, driven by obsession, his good intentions often paving the way to tragedy and heartbreak. As the tears begin to roll down my cheeks, I decide to remember him differently. As a valued friend, a good man, and above all else, a great story, no matter how you tell it. Well, here we are. Let's be honest. When I posted the first of these logs from my bedroom in North London, I didn't think it would go very far. After all, why would it? I wasn't a regular contributor to the site, nor a seasoned veteran of the paranormal. I was just a man who missed his friend, seeking a few words of wisdom from an online message board, open to the idea that it wouldn't lead anywhere. Suffice to say, I couldn't have been more wrong. Over the past few months, the incredible advice I'd received from this forum and the amazing leads you've sent my way have opened up entire worlds of possibilities. It's thanks to all of you that I'm where I am now, sitting in a rental car on a quiet street in Phoenix, Arizona, posting the last of Alice's records. I realize I've written more than usual for my part. I apologize for this. If you want to skip straight to Alice's section, that's fine. Otherwise, please consider this the prologue to the epilogue. It's very, very early in the morning here, with only the gravest of the graveyard shift out on the streets. By the way, I should be in bed, and not wasting petrol on an aimless drive through the city. The ritual helps me think, however, and I'd recently been given a lot to think about, courtesy of a young woman at a local bar. She was a forum member who'd contacted me over direct message. When we met up earlier in the night, it was clear that she'd done a great deal of research, charting every mirror shop in Phoenix in an attempt to reconstruct the route Alice took on February 7th, 2017. We spoke for quite a while about the game, about Alice, and about life in general. Once closing time rolled around, she handed me a printout of the most likely route, with all the key locations circled. Then, in the final minutes before we parted ways, she nervously asked me 2 questions. The first put me in a rather sour mood. The second provided the fuel for my early 3 a.m. drive. Question 1. Are you sure she wants you to find her? I've been hearing the same query from a few of you recently, especially since Part 9 was posted. People commenting that Alice made a clear choice when she left Rob behind in the Silent City, that I was searching for someone who wasn't seeking return. I'd like to take a moment to respond to this, as I responded to it earlier tonight. To be clear, the Alice I know wouldn't do that. She was planning to come back. She told us as much. I'm not going to waste your time with my theories, but we've seen what the road can do to people's minds, how it can carry them away against their better judgment. I understand why it's being asked, but if those sort of questions are all you have to offer, I kindly ask you to find another way to help. Question 2 was less clear-cut. What are you going to do now? It's something you guys have also been asking me, but that was the first time that I'd heard the question out loud. In the awkward silence that followed, it became obvious to her, and in some ways to me, that I didn't have an answer. I decided to take a drive while I figured it out. I've been in my car for the rest of the night. After an hour of aimless meandering, I realized I was close to one of the marked locations, the alleyway where Alice first entered the underpass, the point at which she first disappeared into the road. Turning into the street, just after a large intersection, I was briefly relieved to see no sign of the tunnel. The part of me that still hoped this game was a fiction swelled at the sudden lack of evidence. My reaction was short-lived, of course, as I quickly realized that the tunnel wouldn't have shown itself to me anyway. Even if the game were real, I'd hardly been sticking to the rules on my way here. There was no denying that the place resembled Alice's description, however, and with a long time to go until I'd feel remotely tired, I decided to work my way back along the route, retracing Alice's steps towards Rob Guthard Street. Okay, so I have to admit at this point, I suffered from a momentary lapse of intelligence. In a fog of distraction, residual jet lag, and general dawdry, I drove for longer than I'd care to admit under the misconception that I wasn't playing the game. I thought this because I was heading in the opposite direction, and had started my run with the right-hand turn, when the rules explicitly state that you begin by taking a left. Of course, as I'm sure you all would have realized immediately, that didn't mean I was out of the game. It just meant I started playing with my first left turn. One road later. Alice was always a smart one. What I'm trying to say is that due to this fairly mindless oversight, I wasn't exactly looking out for the woman in gray as I drove past what should have been her corner. There wasn't a mirror shop this time, of course. That's only on the 34th turn, when you're coming back the other way. In fact, I'm not sure which of the many passing streets it was. It's strange, though. As I think back through my journey, I feel like I would have noticed her. The streets were practically deserted, so much so that any pedestrian stood out immediately. I know I should have been looking more closely, but if you asked my honest opinion, I don't think she was there at all. The moment I realized this, I felt it again. The faint, perverse hope that I'd been misled, that the entire story was nothing more than a twisted, elaborate fabrication. It wasn't long until I passed an old mirror shop, and 34 turns later, arrived on what must have been Alice's starting street. It was an inner-city neighborhood whose residents were all fast asleep. From the moment I'd realized that the game was in play, I'd been thinking less and less about this particular road, and more about the one directly after it, resting just beyond the crossroads. I'd come halfway across the world on the strength of Alice's account, but I'd seen no first-hand proof of the left-right game. This whole thing was a hoax, that the next road should have just been another street. If it was real, then I'd know soon enough. I crawled up to the junction with my heart in my throat. With every inch of road that passed under my tires, I found myself hoping more and more that it wouldn't be true. Let someone be playing a prank on me. Let the logs be counterfeit. Let Alice be anywhere else but on that road. I took the corner in a wide arc, parking myself in the center of the crossroads, my headlights facing down the next turn. Ahead of me was a quiet, residual street. Lines of neatly parked cars, rows of well-kept yards, and squarely drawn windows. Yet at its center, in utter defiance of the modest surroundings, the road sank into a deep and dimly lit corridor, cutting beneath the street, disappearing into complete darkness. I'd always known it was true. In the presence of grim confirmation, the question I asked earlier that night starting to ring in my ears, as if echoing out of the tunnel itself. After an entire night's driving, after 2 months of searching, I still didn't have a response. In the end, I just left the engine running, as if turning it off would somehow be a sign of retreat, and decided to type up the notes you're reading now. I thought maybe the process of putting it all down on paper would bring me clarity and leave me with either a note of farewell or a note of apology to Alice for not having what it took to find her. And now, here I am. Still undecided, still writing, still sitting in this rental car on a quiet street in Phoenix, Arizona. Though, perhaps the street's not as quiet as I thought. I've just looked back to the previous road, down the street where Alice began her journey, As I record this very paragraph, I can see a figure standing on the sidewalk, just outside one of the houses. It isn't the woman in gray this time. Though it's almost too dark to make out, I can tell the figure is an older male, well-built and imposing, the rugged features of his weathered face half lit by the moonlight. I've never seen this person before, yet he bears a striking resemblance to another man, a man whose description has been well recorded within the pages of Alice's logs. He's watching me in silence, staring through the window of my still-running car. I wonder if he can help. The Left-Right Game, Draft 1, 20/02/2017. The Left-Right Game was nothing more than a 9-page document, peeking out of a yellow envelope, resting quietly on my desk. I remember reading it on my lunch break. I remember it made me laugh. The submission had arrived with the first post, quietly making its way around the office, treated by everyone as a short-lived novelty of little journalistic value. The story was easy to dismiss, appearing all too similar to the rambling ghost stories and blurry UFO sightings that filled our mailbox on a daily basis, and which most of the senior staff had learned to instinctively ignore. Doomed by association, the document was quickly passed over, my desk merely a pit stop on its way to the rejection pile. I was curious, however, and after an uneventful few months in my new role, I had no compunctions about fishing from the scrap heap. Placing the envelope in my satchel, alongside a misfit crowd of similar rejects, I slipped away to a local coffee shop, reading it in an armchair by the window. Somewhere around page 3, between the description of the game's rules and the exhaustive list of required skills, my mouth started to curl into an irrepressible smile. They'd been gloriously wrong about this one. It wasn't some paranoid diatribe, nor a sensationalist plea for attention. Within these pages lay an introductory glimpse of a man's passionate obsession. As I read on, something about his earnest eccentricity, incredible thoroughness, and unquestioning confidence made it impossible to put down. When I turned to the final page, reading the last of Rob Guthard's charming and refreshingly well-formed submission, I knew that this was a story I wanted to tell. Later that day, I found myself in the editor's office making a case for it. They didn't quite see what I saw, but I was intent to win them over regardless. I told them the story would be characterful, colorful, thought-provoking, and, at the very least, that I wouldn't be gone long. It's been 12 days since then. 10 since I entered the Wrangler in Phoenix, Arizona. 5 since I commandeered it myself, leaving Rob behind in the silent city. I haven't updated much recently, save for a regular set of notes made for my own benefit. In all honesty, after I finished writing up my account of the city, I was struck by an overpowering sense of needlessness. There was no one left to receive these logs. No friends to proofread, no editor to hand them to. It seemed pointless to maintain the same prosaic format as before. I still largely agree with this assessment. It's only due to a set of exceptional circumstances that I've chosen to type up the following account in full. Whoever this reaches, I want to thank you for reading up to now. I'm quite sure that this will be my final installment. The moon has broken. And in my entire life, I've never witnessed an evening so still. The air is cool and quiet, and the Wrangler cuts cleanly through it as I glide down a stretch of even tarmac. The scene is defined by calm and absence. Not a cloud in the sky, not a solitary whisper of breeze, not a single blade of grass stirring on the dark green banks beside me. Yet even on a night as peaceful as this, I cannot help but feel far away from home. The city has served as a turning point in that regard. Before we reached those titanic monoliths, the landscapes we passed through generally resembled the world I once knew. A few obvious exceptions aside, there was nothing about the environments that looked truly divorced from reality. That all changed now. The aberrant aspects to this new world are unignorable, constantly hanging at the corner of my eye, passively injecting a sense of wonder and disconcertion into the otherwise silent night. A few days ago, the moon started to crack like old porcelain. I hardly noticed at first, my eyes fixed on the road as it loomed above me, quietly splintering into 3 jagged pieces. As of tonight, the only empty space between each fragment has significantly increased. If I focus on the sky for a little while, I can see them falling away from each other, charting infinite and loneliness trajectories throughout the barren cosmos, against a backdrop of foreign constellations. The stars themselves fall further than they should. The night sky travels down past the horizon and continues below it, wrapping underneath the grassy bank. It's as if the road and the narrow plains on either side are suspended in the middle of a vast abyss, a platform in the middle of open space. At least that's what I thought at first. It didn't take long before I noticed the broken moon was appearing twice in the sky, both above me and below me. A pair of orbiting satellites, identical and in perfect alignment. That's when I realized that there were no stars below me. I was merely staring across a flat surface so flawlessly mirror-like as to cast a perfect reflection of the heavens above. I was driving through the center of a lake. The water is impossibly still. Since leaving the shoreline proper yesterday night, I've seen neither a wave nor a ripple across its placid surface. It's also undeniably vast, reaching beyond the horizon in every direction and continuing further still. Without being sure how I know, I'm aware that the waters carry on for an unspeakable distance, that I would no sooner reach the stars themselves before setting foot on its opposite shore. I lean over and switch gears. The act of driving the Wrangler was a daunting one at first, but after the first 2 days, I've managed to make do. An old scarf wrapped tightly around the steering wheel serves as a makeshift handle, allowing me to navigate corners one-handed. I don't have an elegant solution for the gear shift, but I've quickly grown used to the process. If I've learned anything from the road, it's that grace is the first casualty in the fight for survival. Adaptability, no matter how clumsy, outlasts it at every turn. A few minutes later, the Wrangler pulls up to a spacious verge, a large circle of land surrounded entirely by dark waters. At the far end, the grass seems to fall away, dropping sharply into the lake with a dead stop. The road continues, of course, but it's the only thing that does. With nothing on either side, it forms a narrow bridge of perfectly flat asphalt, raised on a bed of mud and rock. I press my boot on the brake pedal, using the Wrangler to a steady halt at the center of the clearing. For the first time today, I open the car door and climb out of my seat. The dull tap of asphalt shifts to a soft rustling as I make my way over to the lakeside. There's something on the shore, a barely discernible object, almost entirely concealed by a shock of verdant undergrowth. It's a miracle I'd managed to spy it from the road, though perhaps something about the stark uniformity of the landscape has made it stand out. As I advance towards the water, the object draws near. Its indeterminate form solidifies in my mind. It's a human arm. Reaching out of the water and onto the bank, I crouch down to examine the few pertinent details. The fingers are still embedded firmly into the soil. The thumbnail is broken, colored by a peeling coat of faded varnish. There's a pallid, emaciated quality to the skin, spreading down the arm until it disappears beneath a thick, woolen sleeve. At the point it meets the surface, the water soaks into the fabric, turning it black from the original gray. With a sad exhalation, I raise to my feet and lean over the water's edge. The body of Marjorie Guthrie lies against the silt, her cheeks resting on the lake below, her wide, bewildered eyes staring out into the open lake. She's been almost perfectly preserved, save for the striking tautness of her skin and its malted, gray pallor. She looks exactly like the woman I saw on the 34th turn, who'd tried to repel me from the road, who'd spoken of a lake, drinking her wounds clean. It seems her ramblings weren't completely void of fact. It's clear to see that Marjorie has been exsanguated. So completely, in fact, that the only evidence that blood ever flowed through her veins is a large dark stain across her shredded blouse. It doesn't take long before the perpetrator makes itself known. As I stare into the water, a steady stream of formless whispers sink up through the depths of the lake. The softly spoken murmurings drift up to my ears, taking root in the back of my mind and instantly blooming into a flurry of deeply pervasive promises. I find myself entirely transfixed by the still water as a myriad of generous offerings unfold in throughout my consciousness. The whispers suggest an end to the phantom pain in my absent arm, perhaps even a completely restored limb, stronger than I had had before. Furthermore, it shows me a glimpse of its incomprehensible span, its furthest bank reaching across countless worlds, its deepest point lying below everything. I'm offered a total knowledge of every league, every fathom, every inconceivable shore. My hand reaches down as the whispers continue, every bargain steeped in sweet beneficence. A moment later, my outstretched fingers brush against the soft grass and wrap around Marjorie's exposed arm. Digging my heels into the ground, I lean myself backwards and pull. The water ripples and splashes as I drag Marjorie's lifeless body slowly onto the bank. I feel the voices in my mind grow louder, erupting in anger as I back away from the lake. The promises had been convincing, each quiet solicitation undeniably persuasive. After seeing Marjorie's wretched face and the look of eternal betrayal in her vacant eyes, I found myself aware of a subtle undercurrent behind every syllable, a sense of desperation and timeless hunger emanating from beneath the lake's surface. I already have a clear understanding of what would happen if I had lost myself to those waters. I suspect it's no coincidence that of the countless shores it showed me, all of them appeared to be deserted. Marjorie wouldn't have stood a chance. She'd left the forest alone, grievously wounded and without a vehicle. She'd walked the whole way here, bleeding endlessly. The road's rejuvenating power battling every moment against her body's natural inclination to die. I suspect the road's influence wasn't strong enough, and when a whispering voice promised, ever so sweetly, to mend her, she would have been in no position to refuse. Her other sleeve brushed against my dry hand, her body leaving the water for the first time in decades. I keep pulling until my boots hit asphalt, laying her down on the grass just beside the Wrangler. After a moment of sober vigil, I walk to the back of the car and fetch Rob's foldable spade. A long few hours follow. I've never dug someone's grave before, and my injury is hardly conducive to the task. My fleece tied around my waist, pearls of sweat running down my brow, I manage to slowly chip away at the damp earth. 5 hours later, my back cramping, my hands raw from gripping the shovel, I attempt to lower Marjorie into the rough pit with some semblance of grace, her legs dropping limply into the soft soil despite my best efforts. It takes over an hour to shovel the soil back. It's a sobering and ugly task. As a layer of dirt covers her face, I realize this will be the last time a living person lays her eyes on Marjorie Guthard. Burying her suddenly feels disrespectful, as if it's an act I don't have the right to perform. Once it's done, I drop to my knees, a dull ache in my muscles as I smooth out the disturbed ground with the back of a shovel.
You.
Even before I turn to face her, I can hear a scowl in her voice. There's an odious depth to that one acrid symbol, a potent witch's brew of contempt and accusation that feels like it's been festering in her drowned lungs for decades. Reluctantly, I rise to my feet and turn around, finding myself face to face with the woman I just buried. She looks different now. Her clothes are dry, her skin clear, with nothing to be seen of the deep, dark gash in her blouse. Marjorie? Unlike the empty vessel below us, the woman in front of me is by no means at peace. She shakes and retches with the same indignant fury I witnessed when we first met. When she speaks, her words shudder under the weight of her own turbulent emotions.
I chased you. I ran to you. I gave him up for you.
I'm sorry, Marjorie. I don't know what you mean. Tell me what you mean.
The things I saw, the things so beautiful, and I saw her.
walking alone through the new worlds. I gave
everything up for you.
I don't know quite what to say. It's pointless to ask her what she means and to try to understand her frantic ramblings. In the end, I can only try to speak her language. Marjorie, I didn't mean you to. Marjorie's trembling breaths burst into a despairing fit of laughter.
Oh, yes, you did. Yes, you did. And now you're here.
Marjorie's wild and volatile demeanor shifts once more, her laughter degrading further into a desperate crying panic.
And what did I do now? What do I do now? What do I do? What do I do?
Marjorie cringes with the terror of this self-imposed question, placing her head in her hands and repeating it over and over again. As I watch her wrestle with despair, I'm struck by an idea I've never before considered. The disconcerting notion that, in death, we are not transported to a set destination by some ethereal attendants, that in fact, nothing is decided for us. Perhaps the manner in which we spend our afterlife is down to us, a decision we have to make ourselves. Marjorie is standing over her own lifeless body, still lost, still entirely unmoored. There is no sign of a boundless paradise, inescapable damnation or everlasting nothingness, and the common thread they share, the final release from the weight of our own agency, is similarly absent. Perhaps we never get that freedom. Perhaps we continue like we always do, accompanied by all of our imperfections, uncertainty, and discontent. Perhaps we must choose our eternity. After all the time on the road, that's possibly the most terrifying notion I've encountered. We never stopped looking for you. Marjorie snapped out of her wretched despair, instantly aware of who I'm referring to, staring up at me with an expression I've never seen her wear before. I saw him, walking on the road. He didn't stop. He was never going to stop. I think he was looking for you, Marjorie. He still is. Marjorie stares through me. For the first time since we met on that quiet finishing corner, I can see the faint spark of something other than misery and rage across her tear-stained face. I hold her gaze for a moment more, before pulling my phone from my pocket. In a single sweep of my contacts, I delete every number except for one. A number I pulled from the Nokia during our second night on the road. A number that connects to a lost wanderer of the road. I don't know if this can help, but stranger things have happened. As she stares up into my eyes, I feel like we're finally meeting for the first time. Without a word, Marjorie reaches out a quivering hand and takes the phone from my outstretched fingers. Before I can say anything more, Marjorie Guthert is gone. A few moments later, a refreshing breeze lands against my cheek, a soft zephyr cooling my still warm face. It's a welcome sensation, and the first movement I've witnessed in the air since I set out onto the lake. Wiping the sweat from my forehead, I stare quietly along the bridge, the breeze picking up around me. It's a subtle wind at first, brushing stray hairs across my forehead, chilling the perspiration on my neck. Yet, as I reach my hand out and feel the air slip between my fingers, I'm witness to a steady rise in both strength and magnitude. The sound of the wind grows from a whisper to a howl. Seconds later, the hanging sleeves of my fleece begin to stream sideways. My hair lifts from the back, billowing in the throes of a developing gale. I back up against the Wrangler's hood as the air finally erupts into a roaring, cacophonous cyclone. My hands reflexively seek the sturdy frame of the Wrangler, my fingers wrapping around the grille, my arms tensing as the unrelenting wind threatens to drag me from the road. Squinting through the violent tempest, I focus on a single point in space, just above the threshold of the bridge. In the midst of the storm, a jagged line of white-hot light bursts out of the ether, tearing through the night's fabric, a crackling fissure that widens and yawns, forcing apart the curtains of reality as they frantically struggle to recombine. Staring through the shuddering fracture, I'm subjected to the briefest glimpses of a boundless and impossible vista. It's in a faraway place in both distance and time, an achingly beautiful and gloriously terrifying dreamscape, enduring on the majestic shores of infinity. Every moment there spans a millennium and unfolds in countless directions at once. Every passing shadow holds a darkness beyond measure, their edges burned by a glare of waking sun which looks across every conceivable world with a hollow, rancorous intent. In the midst of the maddening landscape, a singular entity approaches, gliding towards the portal with a clear intent to pass through. As it breaches the shuddering gateway, the wind dies down around it. I stare up at its grand celestial form. The being is unlike anything I've ever seen, composed entirely of electric arcs of brilliant, magnificent light, which burst from a violent and blinding central core. It sounds like a lightning storm, its plasmatic tendrils snapping and crackling, bursting chaotically through the night air before collapsing in on themselves as they fall back into the creature's center. They emit pale clouds of vaporous fractals that fade softly into the air. Somehow, even as my eyes barely adjust to the stark light, I realize that the entity usually burns much brighter. It's dampened its glow for my benefit, so that it can appear before me without scorching my eyes from their sockets. It's you, isn't it? You're the voice I've been hearing. You're the one who brought me here. The bristling maelstrom of light hangs in the air, crackling and shifting, its transient limbs strobing with chaotic incandescence. Part of me wants to hide, part of me wants to run, but neither are an option anymore. Releasing my hand from the Wrangler's grill, I take a single step forward, standing on my own and staring up at the entity's smoldering core. Can I get an interview? The creature doesn't react. In the following silence, I feel it observing me. When it finally responds, its voice ruptures the night, echoing through my skull.
There is little time, but you may ask what questions you have.
Each reverberating syllable forms a string of literal shockwaves in the surrounding lake, emanating outwards from the being in a perfect circle. I watch the waves roll into the distance, showing no sign of ever diminishing, and I think about what question to ask first. In the end, it comes to me quickly. A promise is a promise, after all. What happened to Marjorie? Why did she do what she did? The being pauses, as if considering its response. When it does reply, it speaks with a calm sobriety.
She glimpsed an echo of the future, dreamed of the road, of the things that it passes through.
Like whatever's through there? I gesture through the gateway, which is now almost entirely blocked from view by the creature's spiraling form.
She dreamed of untold frontiers. She saw a lone woman walking them. Over time, the fulfillment of that vision became everything to her.
But it wasn't her. She thought she was seeing her own future. But it was...
It was you.
Those 3 words, as they burst into the open air, casting 3 narrow waves across the boundless waters, hit me with a deep and heavy force. Unbeknownst to myself, decades before I was even born, Marjorie had been driven insane by the dreams of maddening grandeur, of a life of boundless possibility and true significance. She had given everything up to chase a shadow that eventually turned out to be mine. I hadn't just pulled Rob into the game. I was the reason for everything. I was the cause for the tragedy that befell his entire family. She didn't just dream those sights. You influenced her. You let her see them. The same way you made Rob see me in Aokugihara. You pushed and you prodded wherever you needed to so that I'd end up here. Are you the reason Bobby got the rules in the first place?
Yes.
But why? You toyed with so many lives across decades. Why me? Why does it matter that I travel the road?
Because across all humanity, across every conceivable permeation, you are the one who makes it the furthest.
The creature continues.
I've watched you work your way here, through skill and through tenacity, and undeniably through luck. You were brought here because of these qualities, and they will carry you further along the road than any other.
Then why didn't you just bring me here? All that influence and you didn't lift a finger. After everything that happened,
Events transpired as they needed to.
As they needed to? People died. Marjorie, Bobby, Ace, Apollo, Eve, Lilith, everyone. They're all gone. Do you not care at all? In response to my words, the entity remained silent for longer than usual.
I care more than you know. There are things greater than your understanding, forces that exist beyond the realms of your comprehension. You would consider a threat to everything you hold dear. My actions were guided by a higher standard of knowledge. Your protests are predicated on false understanding.
You're saying I don't understand death?
You don't.
That still doesn't make it right.
Regardless, my influence is necessary. That which is necessary must be.
What even are you?
I cannot answer that question in any way you would understand.
That's not good enough. The creature doesn't respond, as if it doesn't feel it needs to. So far, it's returned my every argument with impenetrable certainty. From the domain it occupies, knowing what it knows, my arguments must seem entirely facile, even if it did feel the need to justify itself. After seeing the place it hails from, I wonder if there's any way I could ever comprehend its motives. Still, that doesn't mean my arguments are invalid. The creature's lofty disposition does little more than stoke my desire to oppose it. And what if I don't want to be any part of this?
You are traveling the aberrant strand, a singularly stable flaw in the fabric of reality. As it carries you further from the world you know, you will be freed from the influence of the old laws. You have already noticed the effects of those who settled the road. Those who are lost to it, and in yourself. Energy without consumption. Knowledge without requisite experience. You are shedding entropy and casualty. And in time, you will reach realms of understanding you cannot currently fathom. You will find the answers to questions you never thought to ask. You will discover absolute truth. For this reason, you will carry on.
That's the only reason?
Do you need another?
It doesn't come across as a question, but rather another blunt statement of fact. I understand the effects it's speaking of. Ever since the city, I've been encountering vague notions of fragmented ideas that occur to me randomly and without announcement. New avenues of thought leading to revelations that would otherwise lie beyond my mortal reach. I've started to comprehend things I could barely have conceived of back home, and thought the onset of these notions had been terrifying at first. They grow less so with every passing day. No, I don't trust you. I don't.
Your trust is immaterial. You will travel the road, regardless.
The creature's already stark glow starts to intensify.
I've watched you on every turn, across every moment of your journey.
One of the creature's countless protrusions lashes out at empty air, forming another harsh, glowing fissure. It wrenches itself open in a few stilted jolts. A transparent, almost crystalline membrane stretched across the gap. Through it, I can see myself, in the center of a cornfield, examining a block of C4 explosive. It's as if I'm staring into the past through a jagged shard of one-way glass.
I've watched you questioning.
Though we can't be seen through the aperture, I see the glass-like membrane shake with the force of the creature's voice. As the window collapses, I can see the rows of corn thrown into a frenzy. A second arc lashes out of the sky, forming a second aperture. This time I'm expecting the sight before me. I see myself crying in the forest, a silent radio by my side.
I've watched you struggle.
The second window closes. The creature has made its point.
I've watched you fight to make your way here. You will not turn around.
You make it sound like I don't have a choice.
You do have a choice, Alice, but you have already made it.
As much as I've grown to detest the creature's presumption, in that moment, I know it's right. What it's saying is true. I've done things I never would have imagined in order to get to where I am now. In fact, If this being hadn't arrived at all, I'd already be heading out over the bridge. I'm not proud of what drives me. That same ugly impulse that led me to refuse Rob's offer of return, that made it so easy to leave him behind in the silent city. But there's no denying the impulse is there. It's been with me the entire time, long before I ever arrived in Phoenix, Arizona, and it's been buried deeper than I ever wanted to admit. Do I get to say goodbye? The entity says nothing. It hangs in the air, flickering and coursing with rupturing bolts of light. The next thing I hear is a faint metallic hum emanating from the Wrangler behind me. Turning around, I pace briskly back to the car, opening the door and reaching into the passenger seat. My notebook is booting up, seemingly of its own accord. Picking up the laptop, I lift the lid as I march back towards the bridge. I stare up at the silent being before me. When I look down to the laptop, my email client is already displayed on the screen. How long do I have?
Long enough.
The entity begins to regress, its arcs diminishing as the being at its core turns away. Its message has been delivered. There is nothing more to discuss. As it passes through the gateway, into an unknowable world far removed from my own, I call out after it. I'm still not certain I trust you. The being focuses on me once more, as the fracture begins to close. A final set of waves pass across the surface of the lake as it solemnly replies.
I remember.
I stand motionless in the middle of the road, the entity's final remarks washing over me, its curious choice of words echoing in my head. In the renewed silence, the faint stirrings of an overwhelming and terrible revelation start to form in my mind. It could have simply said that it knew of my mistrust, that it heard the overtones in my voice, saw the disdain across my face, or otherwise sensed it in the space between us. Instead, the being spoke as if my current feelings were a memory, dwelling somewhere within its depths. It was undeniable that my time on the road was changing me, but in all this time I'd never truly considered how those changes might evolve as my journey continues. I never thought about what I might gain, what I might lose, or about what I might inevitably become. A short while passes before I lower my eyes from the empty space above the bridge to the screen of my notebook. Lowering myself down, I cross my legs and rest back against the Wrangler. If you've been reading this from the beginning, you've finally caught up with me. I hope you'll allow me a few personal messages. To Rob, I hope you're able to read this someday. I'm so sorry for everything I've done, for everything I may do. I hope you understand that I didn't know, and that none of this was your fault. You did the best you could, and the days I spent with you were the most significant of my life. It was an honor to know you, and I hope that among these pages you find the answers and the peace that you deserve. To my mom and dad, I'm sorry, I won't be sending this to you. In the end, I was carried along this road by a profound selfishness, and I can't bring myself to face you. I can't imagine the pain I'll be putting you through, and I won't try to justify my actions. All I can say is that I love you, and I'm sorry that my last act towards you is one of cowardice. And finally to you, the person whom this message will be addressed, I'm sorry. I always thought I'd see you again someday, that the roads I took would eventually lead me home. That doesn't look so likely now, though. I could say a lot to you. I'm not going to. But I wish we could have been friends longer. It feels like a lifetime since I first arrived at Rob Guthard's quiet street. I remember the uncertainty as I waited for him to open his door, with no conceivable idea what was about to transpire. Like so many other things, that's now changed. Despite being in an entirely new world, further from home than anyone's ever been, I know exactly what's going to happen next. I'm going to take a drive, take a left, then the next possible road on the right, then the next possible left. I will repeat the process ad infinitum, until I wind up somewhere new. And from there I'll keep driving, beyond worlds, beyond time, beyond the bounds of my imagining, to a place where the lake runs dry, where the broken moon drifts away, and the stars disappear in the rear view, to a place where everything has fallen away, and the road is all there is. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to help out the channel, you can share the video also. This has been an amazing series to do, and I hope you've all enjoyed the music that I've composed for it. If you'd like to, make sure to check out Neon Tempo's Reddit page, as well as their Patreon page. They're definitely an amazing writer. With that said, have a good night.
Hey, everybody.
So you all seemed to enjoy on the last video how I included my thoughts at the end, and if you want to hear what I thought about this story, stick around to the end of the video. I'm excited to see what you all think of it as well. And this story is connected to another story I've done, which is called If You're Armed at the Glenmont Metro, Please Shoot Me. Now, you don't have to have heard that one to get the events that happen in this one because it does explain them. But if you are interested in hearing that story, I will leave a link to it in the pinned comment. No person, well actually, no living thing, has experienced more suffering than clinical trials. Make it a headshot. Shoot me in the temple, aiming slightly downwards. I need the bullet to travel the shortest possible distance through my brain before it hits my hippocampus. If I'm lucky, the sensation of the gunshot ripping through my skull will only last a few decades. As awful as this sounds, you'll be doing me an enormous favor. Death by a headshot, as soon as possible, is vastly better than the alternative. My ordeal started over 10,000 years ago, at 10:15 this morning. I earn extra money by participating in drug trials. I'm a so-called healthy subject who takes experimental drugs to help assess side effects. Once it was a kidney drug. A few times it's been something for blood pressure or cholesterol. This morning, they told me the drug I took was a psychoactive substance intended to accelerate brain function. None of the drugs I'd ever tested so far had ever done anything like this, in the recreational sense. In other words, none of the drugs I've ever tested have given me a killer buzz or mellowed me out or anything. Maybe I've always ended up in the placebo group, but nothing I've ever tested has affected me at all. Today's drug was different. This shit worked. They gave me a pill at 10:15 and told me to hang out in the waiting room until they called me back for some tests. Only about 30 minutes, the research assistant told me. I flopped onto the waiting room couch and read a few articles from a copy of Psychology Today that was sitting on the coffee table. They hadn't called me back when I'd finished reading the magazine, so I picked up a US News and read it cover to cover. Then I read an old Scientific American. What was taking them so damn long? I sluggishly turned my head to look at the wall clock. It was only 10:23 a.m. I had read all 3 magazines in 8 minutes. I remember thinking this was going to be a long day. I was right. The waiting room had a little bookshelf with some used hardcovers on it. When I stood up to walk to the bookshelf, it felt like my legs barely worked. It's not that they were weak, they were just slow. It took a full minute just to stand up from the couch, and another minute to take 2 steps to the bookcase. I scanned the old books on the shelf and picked up a copy of Moby Dick. My arms had the same problems as my legs. Just reaching out 1 foot in front of me to grab the book took a long time. I actually got bored just waiting for my hand to reach the spine of the book. I slogged back to the couch and collapsed onto it in a slow-motion fall that reminded me of the low-gravity hops of astronauts on the moon. I opened Moby Dick slowly and began reading. I started with "Call Me Ishmael" and got as far as Ahab throwing his pipe into the sea, which was all the way in freaking chapter 30, before they called me back.
How are you feeling?
The research assistant asked me. I feel slow, I said.
Actually, it's the other way around. Everything seems slow because you're so fast.
But my legs, my arms, they're moving in slow motion.
Your body seems like it's moving slowly because your brain is fast. Your brain is running 10 or 20 times faster than normal. You are thinking and perceiving reality at an accelerated pace, but your body is still constrained by the laws of biomechanics. Frankly, you're moving much faster than a normal person.
He pantomimed a jogging motion.
But your brain is running so much faster right now that even your fast walk seems very slow to you.
I thought about my slow-motion flop onto the waiting room couch. Even if my muscles had slowed down, my body would still react to gravity the same way. But in the waiting room, I even fell in slow motion. Slow muscles couldn't explain why gravity seemed weaker. My brain was going at warp 10, That's how I managed to read 3 magazines and the first 30 chapters of Moby Dick in 15 minutes. They ran a series of tests on me. They made me juggle 3 balls, then 4, then 6. I had no problems keeping 6 balls in the air because they seemed to be moving so slowly. It was boring, frankly, waiting for each ball to move through its arc so I could catch it with my slow-motion hands and toss it back into the air. They threw Cheerios in the air and I caught them with chopsticks. They dropped a handful of coins and I counted the total value before they hit the ground. The cognitive tests were less fun, but very illuminating. Finish a 50-word search, 3 seconds. Solve an intricate maze drawn onto the poster-sized paper, 2 seconds. View a slideshow projected at 10 images per second and answer detailed questions about what I saw, 95% correct. They told me I measured over 250 on the Knopf scale. Apparently, that's deep into the superhuman range of thinking speeds. Then they sent me home.
It'll wear off in a few hours,
They said,
which will seem like days to you. Try to use the residual effects to get some work done. Catch up on work emails while you're still in high speed mode.
The ride home was horrible. It was only 3 metro stops, and in real-world time, it only took about 35 minutes. But in my drug-accelerated hyper time, it felt like days. Days. Just walking out of the medical research suite to the elevator seemed like it took an hour. I sprinted out of the office, willing my legs to push me faster, but the laws of biomechanics held me prisoner. As accelerated as my brain was, I couldn't do anything to make my legs work faster. The huge disconnect between my body and mind made it extremely difficult to judge how and when to slow down, turn, or rotate my body. I had basically turned into a giant slow-motion spaz. I misjudged my speed and rammed into the wall by the elevator button at a pretty good speed. Even though I could see the wall coming at me, I couldn't make my finger, outstretched to hit the elevator button, move away fast enough, and I jammed it against the wall, hard. The pain was intense. If my brain had been running at regular speed, it probably only would have hurt for 30 seconds or so, but in my accelerated state, the intense pain seemed to last for half an hour, 45 minutes maybe. The elevator ride was horrible. It felt like I spent 4 or 5 hours just descending 7 floors, with nothing to look at but the interior of the elevator car. I sprinted to the metro station. I have to admit, this part was almost fun, even though my body moved at what seemed to me super slow speed. I could still carefully choose how and where to place my feet, swing my arms, and turn my torso. It only took a block or two to get used to having a brain that ran 24 times faster than my body. Then I basically sprint danced the rest of the way, twisting and juking between people on the sidewalk and dodging moving cars with inches or minutes of clearance. I spent an hour, in my time frame, descending into the subway and running to the platform. Endless tedium waiting the 6 minutes for the Red Line train to arrive. Although there was more to look at on the metro platform than inside the elevator, it was still intensely boring. I should have stolen that copy of Moby Dick. The red train roared into the station in slow motion. The normally high-pitched squeal of its brakes was frequency shifted by my high-speed mind to a long, low tone, like a monotone tuba solo. It wasn't just the squealing subway train that was 3 octaves lower than normal. All sound was slowed to the point of near inaudibility. Voices were gone, shifted below the threshold of frequency of my hearing. I did manage to hear a screaming baby on my subway car. Her shriek slowed to sound like whale songs. Sharp sounds like a car horn or trucks bouncing over potholes were low, muddied roars like distant thunder. Back at the research office, I could still hear and communicate with the research staff, but now, verbal communication with anyone would be impossible. The effects of the drugs were still intensifying. I spent what seemed like days on that Red Line train. Days listening to the whale song of the screaming baby and the tuba solo of the brakes. Where ordinary voices were frequency shifted out of my audio range, smells didn't seem to be affected. I never became nose-blind to the body odor, the stench of the train's brakes, and the melange of farts and other smells wafting through the metro car. I finally got back to my apartment. Sprinting through my open door and into the front hall at full speed was like a slow, relaxing drift down a lazy river. I was relieved to be home. At least I had stuff I could do there. I picked up the book I was reading, 100 Years of Solitude, and finished it, despite turning the pages so quickly that I tore many of them. It seemed like most of the time I spent finishing the book was spent on page turning and not actual reading. 3 minutes had passed since I got home. I tried surfing the internet. My God, it takes a long time for computers to boot these days, but it was too frustratingly slow. Hours, seemingly, to load each new page, and a fraction of a second to read it. 100 articles in my newsfeed read and just 3 more minutes done. I dipped into my pile of yet-to-be-read books and finished 2 more. 4 more minutes had passed. I decided to try to sleep off the remaining effects of the drug. Unfortunately, whatever part of my mind is responsible for perception, the part that's been accelerated to hyperspeeds by the drug, isn't the same as the part that governs sleep. Despite being awake for what I perceived as days, my physical brain still thought it was 1:25 p.m. It was not ready for sleep. Nevertheless, I tried to sleep. I walked to my bedroom, a slow 45-minute drift through my apartment, and flung myself into bed, lazily falling like a feather onto the mattress. I closed my eyes and laid there for hours and hours, 10 minutes of reality time before giving up. Sleep would not come. I was facing what was going to feel like days or maybe even weeks of being trapped in a slow-motion prison. So I took an Ambien. The sensation of the pill and the splash of water I used to swallow it sliding down my throat was sickening. A lump that blocked my breathing, moving like a slug down my esophagus. I read a book. 10 minutes had passed. I read another. 18 minutes since I took the Ambien. I threw the book across the room in disgust at my situation. The book slowly pirouetted and spun through the air like a leaf blowing in the breeze. It hit the wall with a long, faint rumble, the only sound I heard for what seemed like hours, then drifted to the floor like a flip-flop sinking into a swimming pool. The force of gravity hadn't changed since I took the pill. The laws of physics were the same. It was just my perception of time that had gone wacko. This meant I could use the speed things seemed to fall in as a way of judging the effects of the drug. Based on how long it took the book to drift to the floor, I estimated the effect of the drugs were still intensifying. I read a magazine. I turned on the television. I clearly saw each frame of video like I was watching a slideshow. Frustrated, I turned the television off. I read some more, the first 2 books of Churchill's A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Not exactly a light read. Frankly, I hated it, but given the hours of tedium it would take to get another book off my shelf, just sitting on the couch and reading Churchill was better, or at least less worse. It had been 35 minutes since I took the Ambien. I lay down on the couch and closed my eyes. Time passed. I inhaled. An hours-long process. Time passed. I exhaled for more hours. Sleep would not come. I needed a new plan. I decided to go back to the offices where they gave me the drug. Maybe they would have something that could counteract its effects, or at least something to knock me out until it wore off. I exited my apartment as fast as possible, taking hours in my time frame to do so. I didn't even bother locking the door. It would have taken too long. Down the stairs, it's faster than the elevator if you run. Through the lobby, out the front door and onto the street. These few things felt like a long day at the office. Sprinting down the street, dancing and weaving between pedestrians with what must have looked like to them superhuman dexterity. Down the first flight of stairs at the metro, across the landing, another hour. Then onto the second flight of stairs. That's when the Ambien hit me. The Ambien didn't make me sleepy, not at all. Instead, it must have had a severe cross-reaction with the experimental drug I took this morning. I was bounding down the second flight of stairs, moving in slow motion, but still making perceptible progress. Then, wham! Everything stopped. The dull roar of the street and the metro noise ceased, replaced by the most perfect silence I've ever experienced. My downwards motion seemed to completely freeze before the Ambien kicked in. My perception of time was maybe a few hundred times slower than real time. After the Ambien took effect, time moved thousands of times slower. Every second seemed like days to me. Even just moving my eyes to focus on a new point was like an impossibly slow scroll across my visual field. Over the course of the afternoon, I learned how to walk, run, and jump when my mind ran hundreds of times faster than my body, but with another 4 or 5 orders of magnitude of slowdown caused by the Ambien, body control was almost impossible. I fell on the stairs. Even though I was all but frozen in mid-step, controlling my muscles was impossible. I commanded my foot forwards for hours, then backwards for hours more when it seemed like I would miss the next step. Hours attempting to adjust the angle of my ankle, then readjusting when it felt wrong. Despite these efforts, I rolled my ankle on the next step. The pain wasn't at all mitigated by the slowness. Hours of increasing strain on my bent ankle. The nerve signals that sent pain into my brain must work differently than the nerves in my ear. Sonic energy was spread out over time, diluted until it was imperceptible. Pain flowed into my brain undiluted by the changes in my perception of time. Hours and hours of increasing weight on my turned ankle turned into hours of increasing pain upon increasing pain. I pitched forward, my high-speed mind completely unable to control my low-speed body. I drifted downward for days, managing to rotate my torso enough to keep my head from impacting the ground first. I eventually landed on my right shoulder. At first, the impact wasn't even noticeable. Then, I felt a slight pressure on my shoulder as I came in contact with the ground. The pressure grew, bringing increasing pain for hours upon hours. My shoulder finally gave out, popping out of its socket with an endless, sickening tug. I came to a stop days later, crumpled onto the ground, staring at the ceiling, the pain in my shoulder still screaming with the intensity of a fresh, violent injury. I had plenty of time to think during that fall. If every second seemed like days to me, then each minute of real-world time would be like years. Even if the drug cleared out of my system in the next 2 or 3 hours, this nightmare would seem to last centuries. By the time I hit the ground, I had a plan. I would somehow get to the platform and throw myself in front of the train. I twisted onto my hands and knees, days of my dislocated shoulder crying for relief. I misjudged my rotation and rolled onto my back. I tried again, collapsing onto my face as I tried to figure out how to control a body that moved slower than grass grew. Weeks of effort were finally rewarded with success. I stabilized on my hands and knees. If just getting on all fours was this difficult, I figured that walking or running was completely out of the question. So I crawled. I crawled through the metro tunnel. The dumb look on the faces in the crowd lingered on me for weeks. I crawled under the turnstile and onto the escalator. The escalator spilled the rush hour crowd onto the platform at the same speed as a glacier spills ice into the sea. I looked out over the crowded platform during my interminable downward ride. The train status sign said the next train wouldn't arrive for 20 minutes. 20 minutes was like a year to me. I'd have to spend a year on the metro platform waiting to die. I crawled off the escalator, enduring days of stupid expressions on the commuters' faces. I crawled a few feet to a concrete bench and curled up next to it, trying to find a position to lessen the pain in my shoulder. Then my problem with time got worse, impossibly worse. The massive slowdown on the stairs was just the beginning of the interaction between the experimental drug and the Ambien. It fully hit me while I was curled up by the bench. I blinked. Years of darkness followed. Sound was already gone, and with my blink, sight was gone as well. All that existed was the pain from my fall. My hyper-accelerated mind wasted no time compensating for the lack of sensory input. Voices spoke to me. They sung to me in languages that never existed. Patterns and faces and colors came and went in my mind's eye. I recalled my whole life and imagined living another. I forgot English. I settled into a profound despair. I spoke to God. I became God. I imagined a new universe and brought it to life with my thoughts. Then I did it all again and again. My eyes opened with geologic slowness. A faint glow. Weeks. A slit of light. Weeks. A narrow view of the metro platform. Ankles of the commuters near me and the advertisement on the opposite wall. I extracted my phone from my pocket. A project that spanned decades. How can I even explain the boredom? The pain in my shoulder is nothing compared to the boredom. Every thought I can think, I have thought hundreds of times already. The views of ankles and advertisements never changes. Never. The boredom is so intense it's tangible. Like a solid object of metal and stone wedged into my skull. Inescapable. What are my options? If I crawl and fall onto the tracks without an oncoming train to crush me, I won't die. I'll experience even more pain from the 4-foot fall, but I'll most likely be rescued by some do-gooder on the platform and unable to act when the train finally does arrive. My suffering in that scenario will be endless. So I wait for the train, so I can throw myself under it. When it finally hits me, I will experience the pain of being ripped to pieces for centuries until finally the light of life leaves my brain and my experience ends. I've lived hundreds of lifespans at the foot of this bench. I am far older in spirit than any human who has ever lived. Most of my life experiences have been a snapshot of pain huddled on the floor of a subway platform, with an unchanging view of ankles and advertisements. This post is my plan B, my Hail Mary, my long shot. I've spent lifetimes typing and posting this message in the hope that someone will read it and become convinced that my suffering must end. Someone on this platform right now. Someone who will find the man curled under the bench, the man who crawled down the escalator, and kill him as swiftly as possible. A bullet to the temple. If you're armed and at the Glenmont Metro, please, shoot me.
Subject S-47. S-47 was a healthy male who volunteered to be a test subject for a trial of a drug called Mentinovix. Mentinovix typically yields mild improvements in memory and cognition. S-47 had a different reaction to the drug. I'm the research scientist who administered the dose of Mentinovix to this poor man, and I consulted with his doctors in the ER after he was found crumpled under a bench at the Glenmont Metro station. I have first-hand knowledge of the devastating trauma that a Mentinovix cross-reaction can produce, so I couldn't understand why someone would beg me to put them through what S-47 had experienced. Then, I took the drug myself. Mentinovix is essentially a calcium ion accelerator paired with a protein that binds to certain dendritic neuroreceptors. It makes signals flow faster through the brain, a lot faster. When I administered a mental speed assessment to subject S-47 30 minutes after I gave him 25 milligrams, he was able to perform incredible, inhuman mental feats. He finished a 50-word word search in 3 seconds, solved a maze drawn onto a poster-sized paper in 2 seconds. His mind worked fast enough to catch thrown Cheerios with chopsticks. Mentinovix had pushed him well into the superhuman range of thinking speeds. His mental speed was still accelerating when he left our offices. I told him to enjoy the extra time he would seem to have, since, to his super-accelerated brain, minutes would seem like hours. At the time, I thought S-47 would view the drug's effect as a positive thing. I pictured him at home, happily speed-reading through books he wanted to find time to read. That's what I would have done, or so I thought. It didn't occur to me that from his point of view, just getting home from our office would seem like it took days. He must have experienced hours of perceived time just in the elevator from our office. A day waiting for the next train, and another day crammed inside a crowded and smelly metro car. If I'd thought of that while he was still in the office, maybe I wouldn't have just sent him on his way with nothing more than a Mentinovix trial pamphlet. But what happened to S-47 was much, much worse than experiencing the equivalent of days on the metro. 90 minutes after I sent him home, I got a call from the ER at the White Oak Hospital. A man had been found behaving bizarrely under a bench in the Glenmont Metro station. By the time he reached the ER, he was unresponsive.
Personnel in the ER found the Mentanovics trial pamphlet in his pocket and called my lab. I took a blood sample and ran an engram decay. I'm oversimplifying the neuroscience here, but basically, the cells in a conscious brain continuously make new connections and tear down existing connections. The new connections represent learning, and the torn down connections represent forgetting. When we sleep, cerebrospinal fluid washes away the metabolic debris from this activity. The test I ran measures how much engram decay, forgetting, has happened since the last sleep cycle. Engram decay is a good way of measuring the equivalent duration of consciousness, how long a patient has perceived they have been awake. We use this in the Mentanovics trials to measure the acceleration in thinking speed. More engram decay means the subject has perceived a longer period of consciousness. S47's engram decay results were incomprehensibly large. I ran the sample 3 times to make sure nothing was wrong with the lab equipment. I got the same result each time. Subject S47's brain had run so fast that in the 90 minutes between leaving the lab and winding up in the ER, he had perceived 8 million years of consciousness. The man had been awake so long in his perceived time frame that he had forgotten everything, literally. His mind had been running so fast that even the nearly instantaneous act of blinking would be perceived as thousands of years of darkness. From his massively sped-up perspective, his view of the metro station from under the bench must have been an eternal, unchanging scene. The near-complete lack of mental stimulation he experienced and the 8 million years of perceived time were utterly devastating. His brain tore itself down in an act of forgetting. The ER sent me an fMRI scan. His cortex had no activity. His gray matter was essentially a collection of disconnected neurons. At the time, we had no way of knowing what caused this extreme side effect, but we noted that his blood work showed that he had recently taken a sleeping aid. We guessed that the 25 milligram dose of Mentanovics, already unusually active in this subject, interacted with the sleeping drug. I compiled everything I had on S47 into a report and sent it to the head office. The company published an adverse drug reaction bulletin and the Mentanovics trial was put on indefinite hold. I never learned what happened to subject S47. 2 months later, I was in my office preparing for a trial of a new blood pressure medication when the receptionist called.
"There's a woman here to see you."
Then he whispered.
"She said she didn't need an appointment because of who she is."
I met my unexpected visitor in the lobby, a woman in her late 30s or early 40s. She wore a black business suit and had a ratty red Jansport backpack slung over her shoulder. She introduced herself as soon as I walked into the busy lobby, as if she already knew what I looked like.
"My name is Helen Kazin. I work for the Department of Defense, and I need to talk to you about Mentanovics."
As soon as we got to my office, she pulled a stack of papers from her backpack and dropped them on my desk. It was the Mentanovics Adverse Drug Reaction Bulletin.
"I need you to do this to me."
You want me to induce the worst adverse drug reaction I've ever heard of? In you? On purpose?
The bulletin says that a high dose of flumenzenil could potentially reverse the reaction. I want you to induce the adverse Mentanovics reaction in me, and when I give the signal, administer flumenzenil to slow my mind back down.
The bulletin says potentially. Could potentially. That's 2 weasel words in a row. The bulletin has a mandatory future research section they needed material for, so they put in the only wild-ass idea they had. In reality, nobody knows how to prevent, induce, or reverse this reaction.
I'm okay with uncertainty.
Why would you want to do this to yourself? For what purpose?
Science. I want to watch someone die. With my own eyes. In extreme slow motion.
I thrust the bulletin back at her. Whoever you are, Miss Kazin, your idea of what science is and mine are profoundly incompatible. I won't help you destroy your brain. I won't participate in what sounds to me more like a satanic death ritual than clinical research. 6 weeks later, I found myself escorted through security in building G164 at Aberdeen Proving Ground. My escort, Dr. Helen Kazin. Those 6 weeks opened my eyes to what a truly well-connected person can accomplish, no matter how demented their goals. Dr. Kazin had somehow gotten a national interest exemption to the Mentanovics ban. I received the original document, signed by the director of the National Security Council herself. Frankly, until then, I didn't even know there was such a thing as a national interest exception to a restricted drug. Helen had also somehow influenced the directors of the huge pharmaceutical company that developed Mentinovix. The CEO phoned me and asked me to participate in Dr. Kazan's important experiment. I asked her if she knew exactly what Helen was doing. She said she had no idea and didn't care, and just told me to give her whatever help she needed. The way she said it made it abundantly clear that I was not to ask any questions. Of course, I did have questions. Why do I have to participate in this was at the top of my list, but I already received a counseling letter from HR complaining about my lack of judgment for letting S-47 go home while he was still in the grip of Mentinovix. I felt pressure to lay down and go with the flow, and that's exactly what I did. Helen met me in the lobby of the massive office building. When she visited me at my office, she wore a black business suit. Today, she was wearing a white lab coat with Kazan embroidered above the pocket.
Thank you for coming. I trust you have the drugs?
I showed her what I brought, a 100 milligram vial of Mentinovix HCl. She had requested the Mentinovix be compounded in an injectable form and a box of Ambien pills. I also had a single vial of Flumazenil, which, according to the hastily written adverse reaction bulletin, could potentially reverse the Mentinovix cross-reaction with Ambien. The guard in the lobby gave me a red badge displaying the letter E for escort required, and Helen led me into the offices beyond. Helen's office was a windowless chamber with a floor-to-ceiling whiteboard covering all four walls and even the back of the door. Equations and strange diagrams featuring stars, circles, and what looked like electrical engineering symbols, or maybe ancient runes, filled the whiteboards. Helen watched me gape at the weird symbology that surrounded us. She laughed.
It's just math. These,
she pointed at the markings that looked like ancient runes,
are just stochastic tensors. The whole thing is just a giant probabilistic differential. Never mind.
She thrust a clipboard of paperwork at me.
Sign these, please. They're non-disclosure agreements.
I worked through the paperwork while Helen rummaged around in the piles of binders and boxes in the corner of her office.
You can wear this,
she said, and handed me a lab coat. I handed her the signed paperwork and put on the lab coat. You're going to destroy your brain, you know. The patient who had the cross-reaction was left with a completely unconnected cortex. There's no coming back from that.
Thank you for your concern, but I have a plan.
I sighed. This was really happening, and I was a part of it. What's the plan?
I'm going to pre-dose with the sleeping aid. I will also take 50 milligram of dexamphetamine so I don't fall asleep. Then we wait.
Wait for what?
We wait for the test subject to die.
When Helen visited my office and told me she wanted to watch someone die, I thought she was a lone lunatic. Someone who did their own research. You know what I mean. I was completely wrong. Whatever Helen was up to, it had the full support of important people. The head of the friggin' NSC signed the National Interest Exemption memo, and apparently, it is in the national interest to overdose Helen on an experimental psychoactive drug and let her watch someone die. Is this an animal study?
The test subject is a human with a terminal disease. He volunteered to participate in this experiment.
She turned to her desk and sorted through a stack of papers and folders. She found what she was looking for and handed me a green folder.
We have Institutional Review Board approval for this. I know it's a little unusual, but everything that we're doing today is approved.
I remembered telling Helen that her experiment sounded more like a satanic death ritual than legitimate science. Now, in Helen's office, with the walls full of strange mathematical symbols and diagrams of stars inside of circles, the same thought again occurred to me. Despite all the trappings of authority and approval, I could not see how this ludicrous experiment was legitimate science. The phone rang. Helen answered with a terse,
Yes?
Whoever was on the other end of the call spoke briefly.
We will be right there.
Helen said and hung up the phone.
We have to go to the capture chamber. I will explain the plan in more detail when we get there.
We marched out of her office, Helen in the lead. We wound through the halls of her second-floor office suite, then into the stairwell. We descended 10 floors, through the fire doors at the bottom of the stairwell, then into another security vestibule. More checking of IDs, more signatures on sign-in sheets.
I put my phone in a small cubby. I was given a second badge that read, "Detain and blindfold if unescorted." Then we passed through a glass-enclosed, one person at a time man-trap and into a long corridor. I read the signs on the doors we passed. Some were normal basement corridor sorts of things: electrical, custodial closet, HVAC. Then the signs got weirder: pharmacy, theology, hospice.
We stopped at a door fitted with a small sign that said, "Capture Chamber." Helen entered her code into the keypad lock. I heard the lock click and open, and I had a sudden flash of fear, panic almost. The feeling was more than just a strong distaste for whatever Helen was doing. I sensed that whatever was behind the door was wrong. Not just ethically wrong or scientifically misguided, but cosmically wrong and dangerous. Helen held the door for me, and I entered the room in which I would spend the next 120 years. The capture chamber was a gigantic space, like a Walmart with all the shelving removed. A flawless white tile floor reflected the ranks of hundreds of fluorescent lights that hung from the ceiling 50 feet above us. A hospital bed was positioned in the center of a raised circular platform in the center of the room. Even from the door, a good 150 feet away, I could tell that there was a patient in the bed. A vital signs monitor stood to the left of the bed. A man sat in a metal folding chair on the right. The platform was surrounded by heavy machinery. Huge cams mounted on shiny stainless steel shafts were linked to a maze of interlocking rails that surrounded the bed platform. A tangle of brightly colored cables wove through the equipment like tree roots or caterpillars, giving the apparatus the look of something organic. Another raised platform stood outside of the ring of machinery. Instead of a bed, this platform held a black leather reclining chair that was oriented so that whoever sat in it could observe the test subject. At least 24 computer monitors were mounted on a metal framework surrounding the chair. Helen led me to this second observation platform.
The test subject.
She pointed at the patient in the hospital bed.
Stopped oral intake 6 days ago and lost consciousness 36 hours ago. We are monitoring his respiration and mandibular movement. We believe he will die in the next 2 hours.
Who is the man sitting next to him?
That's his son. Our protocols specify that the terminally ill test subjects must be comforted by one family member. Because both the test subject and the family member must have top secret clearance, finding test subjects that match the protocol criteria is quite tedious.
Something about the way she said this suggested she thought having family members present was a waste of resources. We climbed a short flight of steps to the observation platform with the leather chair. The chair faced the center of the platform with the hospital bed, where the test subject lay dying. 2 huge mounting stands holding a dozen computer monitors each stood to the left and right, framing the view of the hospital bed. The monitors flashed and flickered patterns that appeared to be random noise. Helen walked to the leather chair, and I stumbled behind, slack-jawed, trying to make sense of this bizarre experiment, or whatever it was. Helen continued talking to me, oblivious to my confusion.
I'm going to predose with the Ambien and dexamphetamine now. The dexamphetamine will counteract the Ambien, so I should have no problem staying awake. We will wait until his respiration slows to be 6 breaths per minute. Then, you will inject me with 40 milligrams of Mintonovix.
She sat in the chair, a surprisingly ordinary reclining armchair.
Please put the drugs here.
She gestured to a small table to her right that held a tall glass of water and a prescription bottle labeled dexamphetamine. Bolted to the left arm of the chair was a gray metal box that held a small garden of switches and lights. A large, red mushroom-shaped button labeled Dose Now stood above the others.
Once the test subject dies, and I have observed what I need to see, I will press the Dose Now button, and you will immediately inject me with 200 milligrams of flumenzenil.
She pointed to her left shoulder. A small square of fabric had been cut out of the lab coat, exposing her shoulder.
This is where you will inject the Mintonovix. You will inject the flumenzenil directly into my neck. I will need it to act as rapidly as possible.
Helen, did you actually read the bulletin about S-47? He perceived being conscious for 8 million years. His mind was gone when he got to the ER, completely devoid of cortical connections. His suffering was unimaginable.
I've done the math,
she replied testily.
With the dosage I'll receive, I expect to experience only 300 to 500 years of consciousness. It should be a nice break, frankly.
A nice break? Nice? 500 years. Years of just sitting in this chair watching a corpse while these monitors flash noise at you?
Those monitors are displaying reading material. That one,
she pointed to the upper left monitor on the right side bank of crazy flashing screens,
is displaying Wikipedia pages at a rate of 500 per second. The one next to it is scrolling through 20,000 works of English literature at 500 pages per second, and so on for the rest of the monitors. News archives, scientific publications, social media, and so on. We bought special monitors with a 500 Hz refresh rate just so we could display information fast enough.
I stared at the two banks of flashing screens. I couldn't perceive anything but painfully bright flickering. You're going to read for 500 years while you observe that poor man over there?
And catch up on a few emails.
She rotated a computer keyboard out of a slot in the arm of the chair.
Let's get ready, shall we?
She produced a headset from the pocket of her lab coat and put it on her head.
This is Helen Kazin. This is the audio record of Observation Activity 54.
Observation 54? How long had she been watching people die in this bizarre room? Helen continued talking into her headset.
Current time is 14:23. I am pre-dosing with 1 Ambien and 50 milligrams of dexamphetamine.
She popped an Ambien out of the blister pack and downed it with a swallow of the water. Then she took 2 pills from the dexamphetamine bottle and swallowed them.
Now,
she said, turning to me.
We wait.
She pressed a few keys on her keyboard. One of the monitors in the right bank of screens stopped flickering and instead displayed a standard computer desktop background. Helen clicked on icons and slid windows around the screen. When she was done, the screen held 3 windows. At the top of the screen was a data strip slowly updating graphs of what I assumed were the patients. Test subjects' vital signs. Blood pressure, respiratory rate, blood oxygen, and so on. Below that was Helen's email box, 1,478 unread items, and a word processing window open to a blank page.
I understand that once the Mentinovix kicks in, audio energy will be attenuated to the point where I cannot hear anything. I will not have enough fine muscle control or breath control to speak, so I will type my observations and anything else I need to communicate here.
She moved the mouse cursor to the word processing window.
Please keep an eye on it as we proceed. It will be the only way I have to communicate.
We waited. Helen ignored me while she read and wrote emails. The patient's respiration slowly decreased. I wandered off the platform to get a closer look at the machinery surrounding the patient.
Stay away from that area!
Helen shouted at me.
I'm going to start the capture sequence soon, and there are a lot of mechanical hazards present when it's operating.
Feeling a little like a chided child, I sauntered to the short flight of stairs leading to the platform with the hospital bed. Aside from Helen, the dying man and his son were the only 2 people in the huge room, or chamber, or whatever. The test subject was an emaciated man who looked to be at least 90 years old. He slept. Rather, he was in a state of unconsciousness that did not look at all restful. His bony, withered body barely made a dent in the soft mattress of the hospital bed. Bruises up and down both arms betrayed a long battle with disease that required a lot of intravenous medicines. "Hey," I said to the son, a middle-aged man sitting next to the patient. He looked up from the book he was reading. Before he could speak, Helen shouted across the chamber.
No communication with personnel on the test subject platform!
The patient's son rolled his eyes and whispered to me. Helen's a bit of a stickler for protocol. I nodded in agreement and wandered back towards Helen on the observation platform. I walked about, examining but failing to understand the machinery surrounding the test platform. I stared at the flashing banks of screens, trying and failing to perceive even a single screen of content. I stood behind Helen and surreptitiously read a few of her outgoing emails. Subject: risk analysis of portal capture experiments. Subject: military benefits of applied theological research. Subject: time card failed floor check. Helen glanced back at me with a glare that clearly communicated she did not appreciate me reading emails over her shoulder. I returned to strolling about the perimeter of the room. An hour passed, then another. I thought about Helen's plan to spend centuries of perceived time in this room. I had only been here 2 hours, and I was desperately looking forward to getting the hell out. To spend multiple lifetimes here, to look forward to spending lifetimes here, was a sign that Helen was different.
It's time!
Helen shouted at me across the room. I jogged to the observation platform. Helen had already prepared the injection of Mentinovix. On the far platform, the son was standing over the bed, holding his father's hand. Helen was speaking into her headset when I got to the top of the stairs.
Blood pressure is dropping. Respiratory rate is down to 6. The probability of death in the next 10 minutes is over 90%. Starting the portal stabilizers.
She flicked a few switches on the control box that held the Dose Now button. A klaxon blared. Red cop car-style lights on the machinery started flashing. The apparatus surrounding the patient slowly came to life. Motors hummed with rising pitch. Shafts turned faster and faster, their cams pushing the strange grid of beams up and down. The fastest moving parts of the machine started to glow and flash, giving it the look of a carnival ride. The machine spun and gyrated faster and faster. The grid of glowing beams blurred. The machine kept accelerating, and the seemingly random flashes became synchronized with the movement of the grid beams, resolving into a glowing 5-pointed star inscribed in a circle that rocked in crazy, unpredictable ways.
Capture device trim active. Dosing with Mintonovix now.
Helen spoke into her headset. She handed me the syringe.
Dose me with the Mintonovix, then stay on this platform and watch my log entries. And what happens when I press the Dose Now button?
200 milligrams of flunazinil in the neck.
Yes. Prepare the injection now. There must be absolutely no delays when I press the button.
I took the syringe of Metanovix from her. You're probably not going to survive this, you know. You will suffer terribly for what you perceive as centuries. Eventually, your mind will tear itself down in a catastrophic act of forgetting.
I'm aware of the risks. Now inject me.
I did. Helen was quiet for a minute. She looked at the patient on the far platform. She stared at the flashing computer monitors. Then, she snapped her head to face me and said,
I think it's starting to take effect.
She blurted the words out almost too fast to hear. Your perception is definitely accelerated, maybe about 10 times faster. Helen turned away from me so fast that she almost fell out of her chair. She darted her hands to the keyboard and typed. The key press sounded more like a drum roll than a human using a keyboard.
I can hear you, but your voice is slowed and frequency shifted. I cannot understand. I will communicate through this screen. Please type your response to me here.
I leaned over her keyboard and typed. How long does it seem to take for my pen to fall? I stepped in front of Helen. Her eyes were darting about in a frenzy. Her gaze oscillated between me, the computer monitors, and the patient on the far platform. I pulled a pen out of my pocket and dropped it on the floor. Helen drumroll typed her response. Days to fall. Sound is gone. Time to get to work. Helen did exactly what she said she would do. She jerked her head back and forth between the screens, reading whatever information they were flashing at her. She opened emails and slammed text into the response window. Occasionally, her eyes would linger on the patient in the center of the whirling machinery. Then she would return to the frenzy of reading and writing. Minutes ticked by. I tried to calculate how long she perceived those 3 minutes to be. If the quarter-second drop of my pen seemed to take days for her, then each second that ticked by would seem to her to be about a week. 3 minutes would be over 3 years. I watched her closely. She didn't appear to be suffering. She could push the Dose Now button at any time, but so far had chosen not to. Her pattern of frenzied motion and typing suddenly ceased. She fixed her gaze on the patient for a second. 2 seconds. 3. 3 seconds were weeks of her time. Helen shot her fingers at the keyboard again. This time she typed a message in the journal window. He's dead. Chaos broke out. A moment after Helen typed her message, the vital signs monitor threw up a red warning message. Respiratory 0, heart rate 0. Helen's hands raced over the control panel in a blur, flicking switches and turning dials. The churning, satanic carnival ride of a machine came to an abrupt stop with a screech and a bang. The floor shook as the foundation of the building absorbed the forces involved with bringing tons of spinning and thrashing metal to an instant stop. The circle and star shape glowed brighter than ever, held fixed at a strange angle by the frozen machine. In the same instant, the patient's son screamed in pain and he fell to the floor. Well, no, it wasn't that simple. I looked closer and saw that he didn't fall. His legs collapsed under him, bent like they were made out of rubber or melting plastic. His legs continued to melt until his torso sat on the platform in a pool of red goo. The man tried to scream again, but the severe trauma, or whatever it was that ruined his legs, started to affect his abdomen. With his diaphragm destroyed, screaming was impossible. So was breathing. Every instinct in me urged me to run to the door, to get out of that room, but I had a duty to administer the antidote to Helen. I would not be responsible for another person going through what S-47 had. Helen hammered out another message. He's taken his second death in the portal. Dose yourself with Mentanovax now, or you will die. I had no idea what the first line of Helen's message meant. Second death? Portal? Those words meant nothing to me, but the second line I understood. And there was no way I would dose myself with that drug. To live 1,000 lifetimes in this bleak underground facility? I'd rather die. On the far platform, the son of the man who apparently died 5 seconds earlier continued to dissolve. His chest splashed apart like a breaking water balloon. His head and arms fell into the puddle that his body had made, floated like a horrific pool toy for a moment, then melted away. I had seconds to think about what Helen wrote. Take the drug and live. He took his second death in the portal. What would happen to me if I didn't take the Mentanovax? Would I literally liquefy like the son of the test subject? As bad as that looked, it would be far better than 8 million years of sensory deprivation the S-47 experienced. What the hell did second death even mean? But where I only had seconds to think, Helen, in her hyper-accelerated mental state, had the equivalent of days to decide what I should do, to decide what she would do to me. I turned from the screens to look at Helen. She was staring at me, studying me with unblinking eyes. For her, every slight micro-expression that flashed across my face, every tiny change in my body language would be an hours-long process. She probably knew what I was going to do before I did. I was not going to take the drug. Helen rose from the chair before I could even nod my head to signal no to her. Her proprioception system was running 10,000 times faster than her body. With that kind of disconnect in mind and body control, moving normally would be nearly impossible. Helen discovered this problem as she tried to stand up. She misjudged the force required and literally threw herself from the chair. In another setting, her fall to the floor would have been comical. She launched herself in a twisting arc. Her arms and legs flailed about wildly, but she was unable to control her fall. She landed face first on the platform and continued to thrash her limbs uselessly for a few seconds. From her warped perspective in time, her fall must have taken a day or two. These futile efforts on the floor occupied a week of her time. Whatever else Helen may be, it's pretty clear that she's smart as hell. She can figure stuff out and learn quickly. That's exactly what she did on the floor. She froze, then methodically began moving one limb at a time. She lifted one leg, then let it drop. She brought her other knee to her torso. She pushed herself up onto her left elbow. She steadied herself with her right arm. Then she rose. For a moment, I thought she was going to fall again, but her movements this time were more controlled, purposeful. She had learned how to move under the influence of Mentanovax. Blood ran from her mouth and nose where she smacked her face on the floor. She glanced at the far platform. The test subject's son was still busily liquefying. Then she turned towards me. Her movements were more like a bird's than a human's, a sequence of blindingly fast motions punctuated by short intervals of motionlessness. She moved sideways with a lurching twitch and grabbed the syringe and the vial of Mentanovax from the table next to the chair. Her eyes continued to burn into mine as she stabbed the needle through the seal of the vial and filled the syringe. "No!" I knew shouting was useless because she couldn't hear, but fear had decoupled my mouth from my brain. Panic and fear replaced all other thoughts. I turned to run. I started to turn anyway. Helen had hours to watch me slowly shift my posture and start to engage my muscles. She lunged at me, perfectly anticipating where my neck would be when her arm reached me. For her, physical struggle must have been an intellectual activity like chess and not a physical endeavor like fighting. In the split second I tried to get away, she had analyzed my face for tells, saw all the small ways my body telegraphed what I was going to do, then calmly made a plan to stop me. Despite my attempt to duck and dodge, she stabbed me in the neck with the needle. Even though her attack was lightning fast, she managed to inject the Mentanovax directly into my jugular. I was already off balance, trying to duck her attack with the needle when she slammed into me. I fell hard to the floor. Well, actually, no. I started to fall towards the floor, but the massive dose of the drug injected directly into my neck took effect almost instantaneously. All sound dropped in pitch, then died away entirely. as if the soundtrack of life was a vinyl record that suddenly stopped spinning. The world froze before I hit the ground. In one instant, I was struggling like a madman to get away, and in the next, I was frozen in mid-fall, like a bug fossilized in amber. I was suspended in midair. Helen's lunge into me knocked me into the air. Both my feet had left the floor. I could see Helen's ankles and left hand at the edge of my vision. The syringe was still stuck in my neck. An annoying, painful pinprick that didn't let up. I assumed it was empty, and Helen had pushed all 100 cc's of the Mentanovics into my bloodstream. I waited. Nothing changed. I was still falling at the floor. Helen's feet were a blurry feature in my peripheral vision. I waited. Nothing changed. I had started screaming when Helen slammed into me. My chest was still tight. My abdominal muscles were compressing my lungs and pushing air through my vocal cords, but there was no sound, and the pressure in my chest didn't diminish. I was still screaming, but with geological slowness. My view of the floor remained unchanged. I returned to the thought that I was like a bug fossilized in amber. Fossilized, with nothing to look at but the floor. I had plenty of time to think about that word. It implies millions of years. From the perspective of the fossil, that's millions of years of nothing. Nothing but endless waiting in the dirt or deep inside a sedimentary rock. In unchanging darkness. S-47 experienced 8 million years of consciousness in the metro station. That's a geologically significant amount of time. That's longer than it took for ancient hominids like Lucy to evolve into modern humans. Imagine everything important that has ever happened to the human race: the invention of language, use of fire, the slow development of agriculture, Sumerians, pyramids, the feudal system. Imagine spending all that time in silent darkness. Was that what I was facing? I felt sick with fear and despair. I waited. Nothing changed. I thought about ancient hominids. I thought about all the movies I had seen and the books I had read. I thought about my childhood and about my career. I waited. Nothing changed. How much perceived time had I experienced? 5 hours? A day? Without anything changing except my thoughts. Judging the passage of time, perceived time anyway, is hard to do. I was still screaming. Air was slowly moving out of my chest. I had not inhaled for hours in my time frame. I waited. Something changed. The floor was closer. Helen's feet and hand had shifted slightly, relative to each other. This meant I could still perceive the forward motion of time. Perhaps a tenth of a second had passed since Helen jabbed me with the syringe. I remember that I was falling face first out of control. It sounds funny, but I'd forgotten that I was in midair, reeling from a high-speed, high-energy collision with Helen. So much time passed in my time frame that my ongoing fight with Helen was a distant memory. Even though it would take days, a week maybe in my time frame before I hit the floor, I had to start planning for my landing now. I willed my arms to move upward to protect my head when I slammed into the floor. Then I found ways to pass the time. I wrote poems in my head and memorized them. Then I thought about Mentanovics. Helen pre-dosed with the sleeping aid for the drug that caused S-47 to have such an extreme drug interaction before I injected her with 40 milligrams of Mentanovics. According to the Adverse Drug Reaction Bulletin, the extreme mental speed-up that killed S-47 was likely caused by the interaction between Mentanovics and Ambien. But I hadn't taken the sleeping aid that caused the cross-reaction. Why was I having a reaction to the drug like S-47 did? Maybe because I got 100 milligrams of it directly to the neck. What did I know about the pharmacokinetics of Mentanovics? Quite a bit, as I was the principal researcher for the human trials. Because me, Helen, and S-47 had taken different doses in different ways, we had different absorption and distribution rates of Mentanovics. My extreme reaction could have been due to the enormous dose I received rather than interaction with another drug. What does this mean for the antidote? Will it work for me? Flumazenil is a benzodiazepine antagonist that is used for the complete or partial reversal of sedative effects caused by benzodiazepines. Mentanovics certainly isn't a sedative. It does affect the same GABA receptors that flumazenil binds to. My educated guess was that the antidote would work for me, The only problem was it could take years, from my perspective, to simply walk to the table with the antidote and inject it. My arms eventually moved upward, like plants slowly growing towards the sun. My arms started in an arms-out pose to push Helen away from me, and slowly rose to shield my head from the slow-motion fall. The floor was even closer to me now. I was accelerating toward it. The act of moving my arms introduced a twisting motion to my fall, and my view slowly changed from the floor to Helen. She was falling with me. The way she leapt at me had sent her into a trajectory that would eventually send her to the floor behind me. This complicated motion slowly developed and evolved over hours and days. Helen's ankles slid into view after I began moving my arms. I tried again to find ways to occupy my mind so that the days-long wait until I hit the floor would be bearable. I started writing a novel in my head. I eventually saw Helen's knees. I tried to remember the lyrics to every song I could ever remember hearing. Then the hem of her white lab coat moved into my field of vision. Then finally, her face. Her eyes were fixed on me. Was she studying how I moved through the air? Was she planning on optimizing her next moves based on how she predicted I would land? I fell through most of a year. If Helen hit me in springtime, I spent summer airborne preparing to hit the ground. When I finally felt my arm gently touch the floor, it was like the first day of autumn. Imagine spending an entire summer staring at one face that was looking back at you. An entire summer trying to imagine what she was thinking about what she was going to do next. Thinking. I was already so tired of thinking. Every conceivable thing I could think about, I had already dwelt on over and over again, all over the course of a second in normal time. I practiced meditation, learned how to clear my mind. It made the time pass faster. I landed on my shoulder. Impact began as hardly a noticeable tickle in my upper arm. Then the tingle grew into a gentle pressure. Then a not-so-gentle pressure. Then pain. I tried to adjust my body so that the fall would turn into a roll, but the disconnect between thinking about moving my body and actual muscle movement was too vast. I managed to twist into an even more awkward fall, saving my shoulder at the expense of crushing my face. My cheekbone hit first. Like my shoulder, impact started as a gentle tickle, but as inevitable as the coming of winter, and nearly as slowly, turned into a pressure, then pain. I imagined an extreme slow-motion video of a boxer taking a punch to the face. In the instant the punch lands, the boxer's face becomes an unrecognizable mess, bouncing and stretching skin and cartilage. It felt like the same thing was happening to my face, but in my sped-up time frame, my face was stuck in a distorted, crushed, and smashed mask for weeks. The skin above my eyes tore in a slow, painful unzippering, and something slowly bent and then snapped in my nose. Pressure on one of my molars simultaneously pushed the tooth into the inside of my cheek and popped it out of my jaw. I winced, what would normally be just a quick blink, and experienced days of darkness. I practiced meditation again. I got good at it. Zen master good. My eyelids finally bounced open, and I was rewarded with a different view. Between Helen's simultaneous fall away from me and the sudden twist in my neck that my head-first impact created, I found myself looking across the capture chamber at the far platform. The bloody and bizarre stuff happening on the far platform now seemed like a problem from years past, even though only a few seconds had passed since the test subject died, and his son liquefied in front of me. But whatever was going on over there had spurred Helen to inject me with Metanovix. Now, with 100 milligrams of it screaming through my brain, I saw what Helen saw. There was a hole in the space above the test subject's deathbed. A perfectly pentagonal black pit was hovering in the air about 3 feet over the bed. It wasn't a trick of perspective or the light in the room. It was a floating hole. A neat, clean cut through our 3-dimensional space to somewhere else. I remembered what Helen typed on the message screen immediately before she injected me. He's taken his second death in the portal. This floating 5-sided hole in the air must be the portal she was talking about. There was more, though. Something, a tongue or a tentacle, had reached out of the floating pit and was busy slurping up the goo that the test subject's son had become. I started to scream. Of course, in my hyper-fast state, no scream came. sound would eventually come out of my mouth, seemingly months after my brain had sent the scream and blind terror signal to my lungs and vocal cords, but without the release of hearing a scream, my mind stewed in fear and terror for what felt like a long, long time. I eventually managed to mentally talk myself down to a more managed state of fear. I was still scared, but I was able to pay attention to what was happening and able to figure out a way to safety. Looking back, during those long, fearful moments when I started to realize just how dangerous and evil Helen's experiments were, I thought whatever would happen to me would happen relatively quickly. I would either soon be killed by whatever was groping its way out of the portal, or I would dose myself with the antidote and escape. Even after being imprisoned in time itself for what I perceived as more than a year, I had no idea the length of the ocean of time that lay before me. To my overdosed mind, my struggle for survival would last longer than a human lifespan. My first impression of the thing that reached out of the portal was that it was a tentacle. On further study, and I had plenty of time for further study, it looked more insect-like than octopus-like. It had 5 elbow-like joints that I could see. From the point of view of my frozen face smash, it looked like it had an exoskeleton or a crab shell. It was dotted here and there with small hairs and pores. A tangled clump of wet-looking, finger-sized bits of red flesh poked out of the holes in the tip. Each one curled like a dog's tongue, drinking the liquefied glop that had been a man a few seconds ago. As horrible and strange as it was, I was glad to have something to look at besides the view of the floor. I stared and stared and stared at the far platform. I studied this unchanging scene with the intensity of a homicide detective studying photos of a scene of a long unsolved murder. I noticed that the 5-sided portal was aligned exactly with the pentagonal center of the glowing star in the circle made by the weird equipment that surrounded the test subject's bed and the platform it was on. The sign on the door to this vast underground space said it was the capture chamber. Was this equipment here to capture the portal? Capture it from what? Why did a man need to die at the center of the swirling machinery for the portal to be captured? The word portal implies a passage between locations. If this capture chamber was one end of the portal, what was on the other side? Until Helen jabbed me with the huge dose of Metanovix, I couldn't see anything other than the liquefying man on the far platform. Why could I only see this with a hyper-accelerated mind? I developed and refined these questions over what felt like months. I searched for answers, both in my memory and in the details of the scene. I studied the strange equipment that appeared to have captured the portal, developing theory after theory about how it worked, without any way of determining which, if any, was correct. Eventually, the complicated forces I had set in motion with my flailing and twisting fall rotated my bleeding face away from the far platform and back to Helen. She had already hit the ground by the time I could see her again, and had started pushing herself back to standing. She wasn't staring at me anymore, thankfully. Her eyes were now fixed on the portal. I drew my knees to my chest and thrust my hands at the floor. I started to perform these motions. I meticulously planned how I would stabilize my fall and bring myself back up to standing. Then I waited for my limbs to cooperate, and for gravity and momentum to slowly bounce and slide me across the floor. Occasionally, I would make slight changes to where my hands and foot were going. At one point, I spit out a molar that was knocked loose when I smacked my face. I stabilized myself and rose. I felt my autonomic nervous system switch my breathing from an exhale to an inhale. Everything that had happened since Helen stabbed me with the syringe had occurred in just one breath. I kept my eyes on Helen as I rose. Helen remained fixated on the far platform. Something about her looked different. I waited. I meditated. I designed a mechanical clock in my mind. I meditated more. Helen's face changed further. She now had a look of fear. She extended her index finger and began to raise her arm. I recognized the gesture, even though she had only just started making it. She was pointing to the far platform. I twisted my neck around to glance at the portal. Incredibly, my situation had gotten worse. A second, long, jointed proboscis had emerged from the hole. This one wasn't aiming for the man puddle on the floor. Whatever was in the portal was thrusting this second appendage into the chamber and towards us. The second 5-jointed exoskeleton human liquefier and feeding tube shot out of the pit and reached into the space in the center of the capture chamber. Of course, when I say it shot out of the pit, I'm speaking in relative terms. My mind was super accelerated to the point where a single breath seemed to last for a year or two. The second interdimensional death proboscis moved fast enough that I could perceive minuscule changes in its position after each long meditation session that I engaged in. To the unaccelerated mind, it must be moving lightning fast, like a barracuda or a venomous snake making a kill. Helen was eventually satisfied that I saw what she was pointing at and stopped wasting time getting my attention. Instead, she flung herself toward the keyboard by the machine. I followed her motion, and eventually, the banks of the computer monitors rotated into view. Before Helen dosed me with the drug, the monitors appeared to be flashing nothing but seizure-inducing noise. Under the influence of the mind accelerator, however, I saw that what Helen said was true. Each screen was being updated with new data 500 times a second. One monitor was displaying the Wikipedia page for Bolivia. The screen next to it was scrolling through some old work of fiction. He tossed the still-lighted pipe into the sea. The fire hissed in the waves, the same instant the ship shot by the bubble the sinking pipe made. The screen below that one showed part of an academic paper, full of equations. I couldn't even guess what the subject area was. I can't exaggerate the relief I felt at seeing this random and eclectic set of information on the screens. These computer monitors gave my mind something to do. I read the Bolivia page over and over. I memorized the page of fiction, and I studied the mathematics so thoroughly that I began to understand it. Eventually, the screen displaying the Wikipedia page updated. A slow process where I got to watch the screen slowly redraw itself one row of pixels at a time. This is what a 500 Hz update rate looked like when overdosing on Mentanovics. Helen started typing. She could take her time, I thought. As boring as the information on these screens might be under ordinary circumstances, they gave me something to do, stuff to think about besides whatever my mind and memories could conjure up on their own. Days later, the first 2 letters of Helen's message appeared in the word processor window. We need to. She wasn't wasting time typing spaces. The second proboscis had visibly stretched further into the room. I read dozens of Wikipedia pages and about 100 screenfuls of the work of fiction that flew up the screen. It was Moby Dick. I wondered what Helen was trying to say. We need to what? Eventually, more of Helen's message showed up. We need to shut it I guessed what she was communicating. We need to shut it down. Shut what down? The portal capture machine? I took in more of the information scrolling past on the 500 Hz monitors. After the seeming eternity with nothing to look at but the floor or Helen's face or the horrific stuff unfolding by the portal, reading Moby Dick and random Wikipedia pages felt like pure hedonism. Helen finally finished her message. We need to shut it down. Breakers on distribution cabinets on left and right. Helen didn't spend time turning around to see if I understood. She jumped off the platform as soon as she finished the message and started running towards the equipment on the right side of the portal. I made a snap decision, which in my mental state meant that I thought it was over for what seemed like days. Helen, I guessed, assumed that I would take on the job of turning on the breaker on the left side of the chamber. She just ran off to the right without checking with me. What if I did this? What were the risks from coming close to the interdimensional horror that was thrashing out of it? Would I even recognize the distribution cabinet if I saw it? Would I be able to figure out how to turn off the power? There was simply no way to think out the answers to these questions. They could only be answered definitively by committing to the course of action. If the answer to any of them was the wrong answer, then things would get even worse for me than they already were. What was the worst-case scenario? That the portal monster would liquefy me? And in my mentally accelerated state, liquefaction would take months, not seconds. That was a pretty bad worst-case scenario. Frankly, it was utterly terrifying. But even after mulling over every possible way I could think about the situation, I couldn't come up with a better idea. Staying on the platform and waiting for Helen to shut off both boxes amounted to spending additional centuries in this room. What if Helen got killed shutting off the breakers that I was supposed to shut off? I willed my legs to move, to leap off the platform as Helen had done. The commands to my muscles formed and screamed out of my brain at light speed, only to slam into my glacially slow muscles. I imagined my mind as a Victorian-era woman trapped in a tower, writing a message with a quill pen. "My dearest legs, I hope this note finds you well. Please jump off the platform." Then the message was sent by Ryder and sailing ship to the other side of the world, while I waited for months and months alone in the tower. From the edge of the platform, I no longer had the view of the computer monitors. I was outside my refuge from boredom in front of the displays. Instead of reading Wikipedia articles and journals from the world of higher mathematics, I spent the time waiting for my legs to obey by studying the death limb that was climbing out of the portal and into our universe. The portion of the limb that had emerged from the portal was dark brown, with 5 elbow-like joints, arranged at odd angles. The design of the multi-radial elbows appeared to give it the flexibility to bend around the complex obstacles. Something about the way it stretched into the center of the room made me think it couldn't see or sense what was there. If there were eyes or other sense organs, they must have been on whatever incomprehensible body lay inside the portal. I passed the time thinking about what the rest of the creature might look like, and what the environment was wherever it came from that led it to evolve into the man-liquefying monster that was climbing into the capture chamber. I finally left the platform. I was airborne for months as I leapt 3 feet to the ground. I configured my body well and didn't fall when I hit the ground. It wasn't exactly the sticking the landing that earns you a 10 in Olympic gymnastics, but it was good enough. Although I didn't hear it, my landing produced noise. The 5-jointed arm seemed to change its pattern of motion when I landed, and instead lashed out towards me. Did it hear me move? I urged my body to sprint towards the back of the room, to where Helen said the electrical distribution cabinets were. I moved forward with the speed of grass growing. The arm pushed towards me, all 5 of its elbows straightened at once, launching the human liquefying mop-like end towards me at a speed that would have been faster than perception for a person under normal circumstances. I had plenty of time to think about the best way to dodge its attack. It was clearly much faster than I was. I judged that I might move forward about 2 feet by the time the arm was fully outstretched. I estimated the length of each of its inner elbow segments and guessed that at full extent, it was going to be long enough to reach me. In other words, I was going to die. If I was right that the extra-dimensional horror that was hunting me was working off the sound of my landing from the jump from the platform, and it couldn't see me, well, a big if, then its thrust would probably tend to aim at my landing spot, near the floor. If I leapt upward, then the fraction of a second of upwards motion I'd achieved before the arm's strike reached me would maximize the distance between me and my landing point. I leapt, then I waited. I suffered through months of terrified waiting to see if I would survive the strike or not. I slowly left the ground, rising many times slower than the moon rising over the horizon. The arm got closer and closer. It was going to be close. What would it feel like, I wondered? Would the process of liquefaction feel like being burned? A rending of tissue? Maybe it would just be a dull numbness. I thought about each of these possibilities, trying to prepare myself for what would happen if the arm hit me. As tense a moment as this was, it still managed to eventually become boring. My life or death gamble felt more like a long-term financial investment strategy. Buy and hold stocks, then wait and wait and wait and see if you made the right choice. I meditated. I reminisced about my entire life. I pondered the mystery of the portal and of Helen herself. How did she learn about the effects of Mentinovic's overdose and its possible antidote? That's when I realized the interdimensional death proboscis, or whatever it was, wasn't my worst problem. I had so much time to think of the plans since Helen typed her instructions to me. Why didn't this occur to me? There was only 1 dose of the antidote. Whoever made it back to the observation platform first would save themselves. The other, doomed to a literal eternity of silent glacial suffering. I was airborne, moving away from the observation platform and waiting endlessly to see if the death proboscis would hit or miss me. Should I attempt to spin about in midair, risking a catastrophic fall and a most likely lethal interaction with the demon from the pit, just to get a head start back to the platform where the antidote sat on the table? What was Helen doing? Was her typed message about the electrical distribution racks a ruse to get me to run away so that she could take the antidote without a fight? I turned my head to look beyond the arm of death to the other side of the room. Weeks later, my view finally shifted enough to see Helen moving behind the portal machinery. She seemed to still be moving away from the observation platform, toward the back of the room where the electrical distribution cabinets were supposedly located. I made a major life decision. I decided to trust Helen. I didn't attempt to change course at all, just maintained a steady, all-out sprint toward the back of the room and hoped for the best. I eventually landed from my leap. The arm struck the ground 18 inches behind me. I ran toward the machinery in the rear of the room, and the arm didn't follow me. 20 or 30 years after I jumped from the platform, or about 50 feet later, I hazard a glance backwards. This initial year-long rotation of my head just to see that the arm was flinging itself toward the other side of the room, toward Helen. What would happen if Helen died? Was the electrical distribution system for the capture equipment dual redundant? If I switched off the equipment on my side, but Helen didn't reach hers, was this whole effort for nothing? Would I have to try and spend another century running to the other side of a room to shut off the switches on Helen's side? I ran for years. I mourned my old life, the life from 60 seconds of normal perception time earlier. And I forgot. That's what brains do. Learning and forgetting are just two sides of the same coin. Gaining experience and gaining ignorant are the same biological phenomenon. 5 more steps. Another year. I meditated. I imagined new people and had years-long relationships with them. Another 5 steps. I rounded a concrete footing that held one of the huge shafts that drove the capture equipment. Then I saw the distribution cabinet. A cabinet bearing a lightning bolt symbol and words in a language I could barely remember. High voltage. It was 40 feet away, years away. I ran and I prayed. I prayed for the demon arm to return, to emerge from behind the panels, or sneak up behind me and strike me down, dead. Finally, there would be no more thoughts, no more oceans of time to suffer across. My prayers were not answered. I kept on living. Despite having a career-long amount of time to anticipate arrival at the electrical distribution cabinet, I still misjudged the deceleration required to have a smooth arrival and slammed into the door. I grabbed the handle as I rounded off the sheet metal and flung it open while steadying myself. 2 banks of 70-amp breakers were mounted in neat vertical rows. At the top, a chunky main power switch with a red handle. I grabbed the handle, an act that took months, and yanked it downward as hard as I could. Nothing happened. Were the power supplies redundant, both needing to be off to turn off the capture equipment? If so, perhaps I simply got to the left side cabinet before Helen reached the one on the right side. Or maybe Helen had been killed by the demon arm before she could power off the racks on her side of the room. Or maybe she had betrayed me and was sneaking back to the observation platform to take the antidote. I invested the time in peeking around the equipment racks to look at the portal. It was still there. A perfect pentagonal cut in space-time, the star in a circle-shaped frame of moving machinery that somehow captured or created the portal still glowed a cherry red. The capture machinery was still powered on. Both of the dinosaur-sized, insect-looking arms still stretched out of the hole in space. One continued to slurp the liquefied man on the platform. The other arm, the one that had attempted to turn me into human juice, was busy with something that was obscured by the machinery. Then something changed. It changed fast, far faster than any phenomenon I'd seen since Helen injected me. It was the lighting in the room. 24 red emergency lights installed on the ceiling flickered on simultaneously. In my imagination, I heard an emergency klaxon begin wailing too, but my mind was far too sped up for something as slow-moving as sonic energy to produce a noticeable signal. The portal changed as well. The once sharp edges of the pentagonal hole in space were now blurry. I thought it over. Then I thought some more, and some more. What else did I have to do? Helen, I concluded, had shut down the right side power distribution rack. Without power to the equipment, the portal was closing or destabilizing, or whatever portals do when their capture machinery powers off. The antidote. I still couldn't see Helen through the forest of machinery and equipment racks, but I pictured her sprinting like mad back to the observation platform to take the 1 dose of the antidote for herself. I couldn't let that happen. I launched myself back towards the observation platform, pushing off the electrical distribution cabinet for extra acceleration. Helen had injected me. I knew she had reasons for doing it, but that didn't matter to me anymore. She co-signed me to a century of silent imprisonment in this room. I deserved the antidote, not Helen. I ran for years, only 40 steps back to the observation platform, each one a bottomless well of empty time that I had to fill with my thoughts. I glanced backwards twice. Each tiny gesture slowed me down slightly, causing months of delay. With my first glance backwards, 10 steps away from the power cabinet, I saw essentially the same scene as before, the portal starting to blur and warp, and the two massive arms still grasping into the room. 32 steps from the power cabinet, 24 feet from the platform. I looked back again. Now both death arms were flailing about. Were they in pain because the portal was destabilizing? Enraged? Still no sign of Helen. I dove onto the observation platform, laying out horizontally in the air like I was playing ultimate frisbee. I hung in the air for a long time, feeling a little like Superman, then like an extremely bored Superman. I eventually landed on my belly and slid from the edge of the platform to the chair in the center. I sprung to my feet and snatched the syringe of flumazenil from the table. I spun my head around, looking for Helen. By injecting myself with all the flumazenil, I was effectively sentencing her to a death as awful as S-47's. Was she going to attack me again to take the drug away from me? I saw her. My decades of worrying and scheming about Helen taking the antidote were completely misguided. Helen was still wearing her white lab coat, was still by the test subject's platform, scaling one of the pylons of the capture machine. What the heck was she doing? I grabbed the syringe from the table and immediately injected it into my neck. This process took months, only seconds of real time passed, but in those seconds, I saw Helen climb to the business area of the capture machine, the topmost portion with the red-hot glowing rails. In one fluid motion, Helen vaulted herself over one of the rails and into the portal. She rotated to face me as she fell. Did she see me betraying her, taking the flumazenil myself? She was too far away for me to read her expression. Helen slowly fell away into the rift in space, and I pushed the dose into my neck. When Helen injected the Mentanovax into my neck, it took effect within a fraction of a second. The antidote, the flumazenil, also took effect that quickly, but since I was overdosed on the Mentanovax, the fraction of a second waiting for the flumazenil to hit seemed like weeks. Time slowly accelerated over those weeks. Helen's fall into the pit went faster and faster. The edges of the portal blurred and bent at a frantic pace. The huge, 5-jointed arm retracted into the pit, eventually moving so quickly that I could perceive their motion like a minute hand on a clock. I heard a soft, low rumble. It sounded like thunder from a storm dozens of miles away. Soon after, the portal vanished. I didn't know if it finally closed because the capture equipment was turned off, or if it was still there, invisible to me because my mind was not running fast enough to see it. The thunder sounded again, the sound rising in pitch. I felt my heartbeat for the first time in over a century, a slow squeeze in my chest. I sensed air rushing into my lungs. Then, everything was back to normal. The soft, distant thunder was suddenly the deafening sound of a siren blaring. I heard myself gasping in air. I coughed, I screamed. I didn't recognize the sound of my voice. My legs gave out, and I fell to the floor with terrifying speed. Everything moved too fast. There was no time to think about anything. Behind me, the door to the capture chamber slammed open. I screamed again, startled by the sound, and turned to look at the door. I didn't have to wait to see who was entering. My body immediately obeyed my wishes. A dozen men and women rushed into the room, security guards holding rifles as they might need to start shooting at any instant. People in lab coats holding Geiger counters and other sensors, a crew of paramedics. They moved so fast, it was overwhelming. How was I once able to exist at this speed? How can a person process information in a world where everything moves so fast? Half a dozen of them surrounded me, blaring commands to evacuate the chamber, asking questions about my conditions, questions about Helen. I tried to answer, but could only stumble out fragments of words. I had forgotten how to speak. They rushed me out of the chamber, the room where I had spent the bulk of my century and a half of life. I was basically thrown onto a stretcher and wheeled to a medical facility that was off the same hallway as the capture chamber. They gave me a bottle of water. I choked on it. I had forgotten how to swallow. They took a blood sample. I heard someone say the words engram decay later. They gave me the results of my blood work. My engram decay showed I had experienced 120 years of consciousness. I was 32 years old when I entered the capture chamber. My body is still 32, but my mind is 152 years old. Most of my life has been spent in anguish, struggling to survive and escape my torment in that huge underground room. I was in the medical facility for a while, days I think. It was like a flash, a blip. I know how to spend a year's worth of time doing nothing other than stare at the floor. Passing the time in the medical facility was no biggie. I recovered my ability to talk and to swallow and to walk. Then they let me go. Someone in a lab coat, one of Helen's colleagues, escorted me out of the deep basement facility and to the front door of the building. It was so strange, repeating the journey through the offices and lobby that I took over a century earlier. "Good luck," he said and held the door open for me. I stepped outside. I saw the sky for the first time in 120 years. I heard the wind whistle and felt it blow my hair about. I wept. There were so many cars in the parking lot. Which one was mine? I couldn't remember. I finally found one that looked familiar. It opened with my key, and I sat at the driver's seat. A to-go coffee cup lay on the floor in front of the passenger seat. Was it mine? I didn't remember. I opened the glove box and found the registration. It had my name and my address. Which of these cars was Helen's? Had she driven to work expecting to fling herself into another dimension? I couldn't drive. It was too frightening, only having seconds to react to the changing traffic lights and motion of the other vehicles on the road. I walked to the main gate and got them to call a cab. The taxi delivered me to the address on my registration, a vaguely familiar-looking townhouse whose door opened with my key. Recovery is going quickly. Everything is going quickly for me, compared to my life in the capture chamber. The days race by with terrifying speed. I spent a week writing down everything I remember from my long life in the capture chamber. I'm posting the record of my experiences here. Whatever is going on in that government lab should not be a secret. I know I signed an NDA in Helen's office, where I agreed not to discuss what I saw and experienced. Frankly, though, I don't care. What are they going to do? Put me in jail for a few years for divulging secrets? Believe me, I can do the time easily.
you.